Okay, and we're in. How are you doing today?
I'm good. I'm good.
Thank you so much for coming into the studio.
Happy to. A really nice studio, by the way.
Thank you. Thank you. So look, summer's over.
It is.
We're now heading into like the time of the year when people are doing real work. So how busy are you right now?
It's funny because I have small kids, and so they have this idea of summer break, and they say goodbye and say, have a good summer. And I'm like, as adults, we don't have that. Like, It's sort of a 365. So I would say August, things in the industry tend to go slow. Everyone's taking time off. But now, yes, now we're back. Now we're back from school, from summer break.
We are back. It's like we're back from COVID. We're back from the writer's strike. We're back from the actor's strike. We're back from summer break. It's just been nonstop.
It is an unprecedented time of change in Hollywood and entertainment.
Yeah.
I've never seen anything like it. And I think it's adapt or not or go under. But it's crazy how much things have changed.
I'm really trying to get someone on the podcast from AMC movie theaters just to like really get like an inside scoop because no one's making anything, right? Like apart from Disney and the big studios like Tom Cruise and all this shit, like all the independent films just aren't getting made.
And even every network, I mean, I'm in television, so usually you'd have 15, 20 pilot presentations. Now it's like 4 or 5, and they have to have The Rock or Jennifer Aniston or something that they think is completely bankable. So it is a level of fear. And there's always a level of fear, but the level of as sure as I can be about this financial bet. And so there's very little creative swings happening.
It's really true. So just as an aside, I've been making adventure television for decades, right? And it was funny because like when you would go to Discovery Channel or National Geographic, a senior producer there would get like, $10 million of budget for the season, and they'd invest $1 million in 10 different projects.
Yeah.
And now it's just like, $10 million, Chris Hemsworth.
Yes. And just for VO, like he's not going to show on camera, but just for VO, and maybe he'll do the promos. But it's all spent, and there's no swings, and it's funny. I say to people since COVID, where everything got assembly line, because none of us are in offices anymore. Everything, pre-production's outsourced, and you're all on Zoom, and post is outsourced, you're all on Zoom. There's no chemistry, and that chemistry is what creates really interesting things, and that's why nothing's sort of popped, is because you don't have that chemistry of being in a room where everyone's sort of staring at the ceiling, and they're like, okay, what if we did this? You're on a Zoom, and your mind is drifting to like, oh, right, my phone. Oh, yes, there's text. And so no one's fully focused. And I think that's why nothing's sort of creatively exciting or new or popping.
Yeah, it's like you can't beat the magic in the writer's room when everyone turns off their phone.
No, 93% of communication between people happens non-verbally. And so when you're in a room, only 7% is the words. The rest is expression and tone and the tapping of the foot and all that stuff. That's all part of the creative process. When you're sitting and you can't think of an idea, but you're all in the room, and so you're looking around and someone says something, you're like, what about that? Now we're in a world of partial attention. And so you're not focused on that creative process. You're focused on that as well as 7 other windows that are open. And it makes a difference in the creative process because there's no right answer. There's just whatever is creatively unusual and interesting. And now it doesn't feel like people are trying to exceed the bar. They're just trying to make the bar. Just check the boxes.
Yeah.
Do we have Chris Hemsworth? Check. Is it got 3 acts? Check. And then that's it.
Well, that's the defense mechanism, right? Like that's, you're dealing with people who are on salary, right? They may not be entrepreneurs. They might not have their own production companies, like for potentially you and me. Like they're worried about their jobs. So if they just check the boxes, they know that if it fails, they're not going to get fired, right? And that's important.
And now it's not even fired. Well, the whole thing disappear. I have friends who run networks, and they're very clear this whole ship is going to go under in a year or 2. And so it's not even, there's the hope of it breaking out's gone because, as you know, with all these mergers, it really doesn't matter what you do in a network because you're one of 20 now in a portfolio. And even that is written off at the end of the year as a loss that you can offset some other part of the conglomerate. Mm-hmm. So it disempowers people to do great things because it doesn't really matter because it's part of a bigger financial chain that's going on. And I think everyone feels that, whether you're an accountant or something, you're part of something really big that doesn't really care about you and what you do. And I think it's an unprecedented era of people feeling helpless and hopeless that what they do doesn't matter.
I think so, yeah. And I find it super frustrating actually because I actually just make TV shows with myself in them, right? So I produce, direct, and host my own adventure shows. So I was working with BBC Earth and Discovery Channel for years, traveling all around. And then COVID hit, and then it's like the risk profile just stopped.
Yes.
And it's been unbelievable trying to get back into this space.
It's interesting because they're in every tough time there's an opportunity. And I think this last year or the year before was the first time that ad sales, they'd spent more money in creator-based economy than they had in traditional television, which means your YouTubes, your TikToks. And so really the money is not going to traditional cable, it's going to the creator. So there's a way of looking at it that someone who has a setup, can break out in some way that they never could before. When I started, there were 10 networks. You either knew those 10 people or you didn't, in which case you either had a career or you didn't. Now there's a lot of different ways to do it, and there's some freedom in that, because right now the system itself is too fear-based. It's really too fear-based.
Yeah, it's really slowed down. Like I'm hoping I can get to a stage in the next like year or two where I can go to Argentina and film for 2 weeks and make a 46-minute episode and actually just put it on YouTube.
Yeah.
And somehow monetize that with a partner.
Yes,
Yeah.
that seems to be the only way, and it's definitely the only way you'd have ownership. That there is no ownership given at all. I mean, you can have a large production company, and the way they define your participation financially is so convoluted that you will never see a dollar of it.
Yeah.
I'm represented by CA, largest agency. It's so rare that I ever see a penny of ownership. Even if it's there in the contract, it'll never actually come out. And so to own things, you have to own them now. And it makes sense, because what is the studio and the network model offering you? They can't even get the viewership of most of the YouTube channels. I mean, a dream for MTV is to be what a medium-sized YouTuber can do now. And that's their dream, and they have advertising and overhead. And so the audience is just not coming. I think with a world saturated with screen, you need to be creative. The audience knows the difference between something that's produced or painted by numbers and something that's really interesting. And nothing really interesting is coming from the traditional models.
No, it's true. And YouTube, but there's all kinds of amazing stuff going on there. And I even had a television producer a couple months ago sit down with me and said, look, buddy, like your content's great, but this whole like travel genre and adventure genre, he goes, it's 100% on YouTube now, and we're not even looking at it.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's absolutely true, because for them, again, most things in America run by liability. And so the largest amount that we would spend on a travel show would be insurance. That you're going to all these places. I imagine you're doing adventure. You're not going to like Paris, the Champs-Elysees. You're going to outreaching places. The liability of that is too high. And so they're not going to go and dip their toe into something that has the liability. I mean, everything in America is run by liability. And so you taking the whole responsibility of liability is much more appealing to them than them having the entire company be at stake. So I'm not surprised.
Just as an aside, I could get into way more trouble in Paris for a week than I could in Papua New Guinea.
Probably, but that might be a different show. That might be sort of a later night show, not sort of your daytime traditional look at the sunrise.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
There's a lot to do in Paris after night.
A little Bourdain-esque, perhaps.
What talent. What talent.
Yeah, he was my hero.
Yeah. I mean, and the whole thing, his whole secret was being able to actually really listen. I think when you do shows, like whenever I do reality, I do transformative reality, it's so funny because they want it to be real, but I have in Video Village 7 executives, and they're like, could she do this? And I'm looking at them and I'm like, well, she's not doing that now. Do you want me to go in and make her say that thing? And it's this strange thing, whereas Bourdain just had the ability to sort of follow what the actual story was and follow what the conversation was. And that actual connection was what I think people resonated with the most.
And they let him write his own shit.
Yeah.
And I think that like 0.0 were the production company there, and they did the deal with CNN, and they just let him write his own monologues. They let him write his own dialogue. They let him write his own voiceover. And that just gave like a genuine feel to basically everything that came out of his mouth.
Authentic,
Yeah.
which is the whole point of what we do, is what is authentic as opposed to scripted. I know the executives at CNN, and they were like, it's one of the easiest shows we do because you kind of let him just do his thing. And I was like, that's sort of what it used to be. It used to be that you come in, pitch an idea, and they would fund a pilot, a good amount for a pilot, and then they'd be like, you have a creative vision, go for it. And then suddenly one executive started showing up, then 2, then 4, and I was like, wait a minute, why are there so many people sitting in my, and they're just all, the fear is the first cut will come in, there'll be some problem with it, they'll be asked, why didn't you? And then they'll be afraid that they are going to get fired. So the fear just kept coming, and more executives kept showing up. And I had this reputation that whenever I did a show, even a big show, network execs would not stay more than 1 day. Because after a day, it was this awkward thing where they're like, okay, you know what you're doing, and if there's a problem, you can solve it, and we'll just go deal with the other shows that have problems. But that was always the best compliment to me, is that the network executives stopped showing after day 1. I was like, okay, they trust me.
Well, the thing they don't get is it's like, okay, for me, it's like my face is the show. My name is on the show. Like, I want this show to be as good as possible. Like, I don't need you to push me along, like, and tell me where it needs to be better, or the fact that, like, that I really need to work hard on it. Like, I know, like, my whole career is riding on this show. Like, I don't need that in the background, And I think a lot of these executives, like, they don't know what to do. So they think they just need to nitpick, and somehow that is making a contribution.
I think there's a epidemic of middle management.
That.
I think whoever's listening to this, whatever you do, whether you're creative, whether you're an account, there are layers and layers and layers. And I think what that does is I did research in University of Pennsylvania with Martin Seligman, and his theory was called learned helplessness. That at a certain point, if you feel like you take the initiative, you try, and you get feedback that it could be better, and then you don't try and you get the same feedback, at some point you're going to stop trying. And I think this level of middle management that's there everywhere is taking the fire and the initiative out of people. I would always tell network execs, I can't imagine you could ever be harder on me than I am on myself. Like, there's no way you could show up at the edit bay and put more energy in making it as I do. Like, I'm living there, I'm sleeping there. And I think they got that. And I think for anyone who's creative listening, that key is, and it's there's no data on this, is to believe in yourself so completely that you just know in your gut it works. And that gut may make you fail, but the key is to do that and to learn from it. Otherwise, if you don't take those risks and you don't believe in yourself so completely, you will be influenced by everyone around you. And you will eventually at some point not know what your own instincts are. You'll just try to please everybody. And it makes terrible creative decisions.
Yeah, there's nothing worse than being pulled in 100 different directions and trying to please 100 different people.
No, nothing fun comes from committee. Like, nothing in the world that's fun or interesting comes from committee. Not in government, not in entertainment, nothing.
Yeah. I like this, the pandemic or the epidemic of middle management. Yeah.
And it's so funny. I have friends who are producers for many years, and then they'll get a job. It usually coincides with them having a child, that they're like, oh, I'm going to take a network job. And I'm like, oh, the stability, I get it. And then at some point I'll ask them when we meet up, what's it like in there? And they always say the same thing. No one knows what they're doing. Always, that there is no rhyme or reason to any of it, that you'll have a great idea that everyone vouches for, they won't do it. But Jennifer Lopez says, I'm interested in doing a show about whatever, and you're like, okay, we'll put $100 million behind it. That there is no real rhyme or reason to it. And I think that's always been the trick of the creative industry, is there's no data. There's no way to know. It's just an instinct. I always tell people, my shows are done, edited, finished, locked before they ever see an audience. And so if the audience has any feedback, I'm like, well, I would have known that on episode 2. Now it's episode 8, it's all done. Which is why I like the dynamic process of sort of YouTube and all, is because you get the feedback and then you can adjust and pivot. The way we do traditional television, everything is locked up and done before you ever see an audience.
Yeah.
And the worst thing is you see focus groups. And so those 10 people, they make sweeping decisions over what, and you're like, those were 10 people in a specific situation. And by the way, putting people in a room with two-way mirrors that they know they're being watched is not the best way to test an audience, because you always have their own dynamics in the group. You have the bully, you have the alpha, and you're watching this through a two-way mirror, and you're like, this is not America. These are people who have showed up to be paid to basically tear something apart. They know that. They'll get paid. So this whole focus group as the testing ground is a terrible idea.
And if they don't say something, they won't get paid to do it again, right? So if they're like, wow, that was just beautiful as it is, which no one would ever say.
Correct. No. I mean, literally, and that's true of a network executive. Like, done, great. Like, I didn't add anything.
Yeah.
So yeah, everyone has to justify their part of the equation.
So the way I've tried to avoid this for the last 15 years I've been doing this is I've been raising money privately through corporate partners. And then what I do is I try to get one broadcaster on board as a pre-sale. So they'll give me a little bit of money up front to acquire it for 1 or 2 or 3 years, and then the rights come back to me, but just for that one territory, just so I have a name attached to it, like a Discovery or something like that. And then I go out, I raise the rest of the money privately, and then that one territory is taken. I got a little bit of pre-sale, I got a little bit of branding, and then the rest of the world territories are mine. Yeah. And then I have an agent in London that sells into all that and
very smart
manages it all, because I can't sit in those meetings anymore.
No, and I mean, the meetings were already insufferable. Now they're just intolerable. But I think that's a very, very smart way. And it's interesting, even that brand name now doesn't carry the weight it did. For example, people will watch shows. Very few of them know the production company or the network. It ended up on my phone, or it ended up on my Fire Stick, or it ended up on my Roku. I know I watched it, but I don't have any association or any loyalty to that network brand. That used to be MTV stood for something, AMC stood for something. And now that doesn't. And so even that pre-sale is going to be less and less inviting because you're giving up something, whereas opposed to owning the whole world. It's a very smart way of doing it.
Yeah.
I just wonder, as you move forward, if A, those networks will still be around,
Yeah.
and B, is what their name and cachet offers gets less important.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's still important for the corporate partners that,
Yeah,
like,
that's true.
if a motorcycle company or a car company is going to give you $100,000 or $200,000 to do something, and chip in a little bit, they still want to know that it's going to go out in one territory here, and then they understand, like, then you have to explain distribution to them and stuff like that, which is a whole nother rabbit hole.
And I mean, distribution, what does that even mean anymore? I was talking to someone who's an independent film producer, and I was like, what does that even mean? No, do your premieres on Amazon? No, your premiere is on Netflix. Like, the actual theaters are almost like a perfunctory thing. Like, yes, I'm going to open in 2 theaters so that I can qualify for certain film festivals and awards. But other than that, my distribution's on American Airlines.
Yeah. It's wild, isn't it?
It's because the screen is everywhere and the content comes with it.
Mm-hmm.
And so how do you monetize this? I think the music industry got this first, which was, I don't need to pay you as a musician for your song. I can get it anywhere I want. And so now, with the increasing rate with which we can download things, now videos followed.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's become incredibly hard to monetize.
Yeah.
And so generally I'll find that most people, like musicians I know who used to make money on concerts, now make it in the after appearance. That's where the money is. It's not in the concert.
Oh.
It's in the actual after. It's not in the recording for sure.
Mm-hmm.
It's in the after appearance, the after party, the show, the meet and greet. That's where the money is made.
Because they charge.
And that goes to them, as opposed to the complete sale with Ticketmaster, and then some of it goes to the label, and some of it goes to the band, and some of it goes to the venue. And so the real money making is the FaceTime experiential. But that's the only thing that goes right to their pocket.
So if you pay like a $25,000 extra, you can go hang out with Jay-Z after a concert.
Exactly.
That's interesting.
Yeah, it's funny because I did a show with Nick Carter, who was the Backstreet Boys, and he was touring with the band, and he was like, we don't make a lot of money doing the tour, and the tour goes all over the world. It's when we hang out afterwards, and each fan pays whatever to have a meet and greet and a photo op, and it's all about the photo op now.
Yeah.
If you have the photo, you're good. And so that's where the money is made for artists. And I think in general, even for me, what I'm moving is away from screen experiences to real world experiences, because they're so desperately needed now. There's a saturation in the screen, and there's a lack of options in the real world.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. Like, I've always had a pretty busy speaking career, so I've always been doing a lot of events, whether they're at boarding schools, universities, Fortune 500 companies, whatever, right? Because they want to do the meet and greet with someone who's gone out and done crazy stuff, and I went out and did some crazy stuff. So it's been, but
not being on your resume, like under relevant experience, just says crazy stuff, and you list like what you've done.
I rode a motorcycle around India and survived. I rode a motorcycle around China and set a Guinness World Record and also survived. And then Brazil, that was the worst one in the Amazon. And then with all the mountains and stuff like that in between, it makes for a good talk. But
I imagine it would.
Yeah.
There's certain life lessons that you would learn on the road in China that you wouldn't learn anywhere else.
That's the truth. So let's go back a bit. So how'd you even get into this business, and where are you from originally?
I was born in Pakistan.
Okay.
Born in Pakistan, but we came here at a very young age.
Mm-hmm.
And then I lived in rural America, completely rural, small town America. And I was going to be a doctor. I come from hundreds of years of doctors, and I like that aspect of helping people, of transforming. And so I was going to be a psychiatrist. And I went to college. I was pre-med, president of Pre-Med Society, president of Psychology Honor Society, ready to go to medical school. And the story is that I actually was, at the time, really struggling with being gay at the time. Very different era, mid-90s. And it was less about being gay than it was about AIDS.
Mm-hmm.
That it was this idea of this thing about me that I hated about myself and was ashamed of could kill me. And so I was really struggling. It was finals. And I remember I was procrastinating studying. I was at home at my parents' house. I was alone at the house. And a movie came on. It was an old art house film called Morris. A gay love story set in Edwardian England. And in that 2 hours that I watched the movie, it was the first time it had ever occurred to me that gay love could be as beautiful as any love story. It had never occurred to me. And that changed my perspective on everything. And I was like, that medium is incredibly powerful. And that's the day I changed my mind. And so I graduated pre-med, and then I got in an old Volvo and drove across the country by myself. Ended up coming to LA, dead-ended into the Pacific Ocean, made a U-turn, rolled down my window, and I was like, where's LA? And the person said, you're here. And I said, but this is Santa Monica. And he's like, that is LA. And I'm like, I don't understand. Like, it's a completely different city. And then was a bartender, and then started as a trainee at William Morris Agency.
Oh.
And so that was a time before HR, and it was horrific, abusive. I remember there was a section of 4 female agents, and it was referred to as the bitch pit, because the screaming, you would walk by. And once I had lunch because I put my agent on a flight that didn't have a phone, and so I could take lunch. Otherwise, I never, ever took lunch. And she came in pale-faced, and she's like, what is going on? And I was like, what? And she goes, there's literally screaming echoing in the halls. I was like, oh, no, that's normal. That's every day here. It was horrific. I remember my agent threw a stapler at my head, and I ducked. I remember like things being thrown at me constantly, yelled at, screamed at all day. And you go to HR, and they'd be like, what do you want us to do? Like, go back.
This sounds like Ari Gold's Entourage.
It absolutely does. And there was a art house film called Swimming with Sharks that I could not watch for years because it was exactly the agent I worked for. And so that was where I started. And it was horrifically abusive. But being in an agency, you're the middleman. You see everything. You see how the creatives work. You see how the networks work. It was incredible learning ground. And so then I first was in scripted film because of the experience I had that made me go into entertainment. And I ran the company that produced Gosford Park, which won an Oscar for script and Golden Globes and all. It was the first thing that put the company on the map. And it's a funny story because it's a very Hollywood story that when I started the company, my boss and I, we just had a handshake deal that whatever his credit was, mine would be one below. And as Gosford Park started coming together, he was like, yeah, I don't know if we can give you a credit on this one, but the next one. And I was like, oh no, like this is exactly what happens. And so I was like, I don't know if I have it in me to build more than 2 companies. And so the second one I should do for myself. And so if you watch Gosford Park, I have no credit. Literally didn't even put me on as a production company. He took
That's ridiculous.
No credit whatsoever. And I was the only one doing the notes with Robert Altman for years. But that's a very, very Hollywood story that I was very young. I did all the work. There was no one else in the office. And then when came time for credits to be handed out, it was like, no, we'll keep you in the back.
And that's not even a monetary fuck you. That's just like I just want to fuck your career. Like that makes no sense.
It is. You know what's funny? I've been a showrunner for many years, and I always promote. And people who come and work with me are like, "You're the first time someone promoted me," and I was like, "It takes nothing for me to promote talent. It doesn't take away from me." And people don't do it. They think that there's only so much success and that it's limited, and that they won't share it. And I've never believed that. I think there's enough success for everyone. But it's this fear-based, I finally broke through, and so I'm going to protect what I have, is 95% of Hollywood.
That's really messed up. You know, because when I had a production company as well, and I had at one stage I probably had about 8 or 9 people working pretty much full-time for me. And I would always kind of push them up, promote them, especially on social media and stuff like that. And you know what? They liked that so much that they started bringing their friends in to work with me. So like at one stage I had like this entire NYU mafia of 20-somethings that were just really good at their jobs, and they really worked hard, and we had a great working run up until 2020. But it's funny, like this idea of, you know, you hiding the people that do the real work or that someone else is, I mean, it's amazing when you can promote someone and watch them grow and develop. And if they leave you, they'll probably come back at some stage, or they'll go off and do their own thing, and then you can work together later. Like
entertainment draws very insecure people for a variety of reasons. Whether it's the people who were picked last, or the people who were odd, or the people who it just does. And so you're constantly working. I remember when I finally quit William Morris, my agent at the time looked me in the eye, and I was 22, and said, I will make sure you never, ever, ever work again. And I worked for him, and I give it, and literally looked me dead in the eye. And I'm 22, and I remember thinking at the time, that can't be true. You can't stop every path of that's out there for me. And he would look me in the eye, and he's like, I will stop anyone from hiring you. That level of insecurity is often connected with creatives. I have always believed that's enough for everyone, and I think with anything creative, you don't get your best work from people unless they feel excited and inspired and appreciated. You just don't. And I feel for people entering the job market, millennials and below, that they've never had any loyalty to them. They've always been, work for hire. They've always been gig to gig. And so there's no loyalty to them. So I think when they feel like, oh, someone cares beyond this job, that I exist, that I have dreams, that I have a goal of myself, I think that really matters and resonates. And they give you the best work because they feel looked after. That to me is one of the things I'm very proud of. I'm a really good manager of people. They work incredibly hard, but they feel like someone cares about not just what they're doing on this job, but in general who they are.
So what made you want to not go, what made you give up the medical profession?
It really was this film. It was this film, and I thought, I've changed my whole perspective on my life and myself in 2 hours. Like, what I could have gone to therapy for months and months and months. I don't think it would have created the shift. The thing about entertainment is that things are not taught, they're caught. And that's what's so powerful about entertainment, is that it's one of the few spaces that you don't lead with your ego. you're leading with a transformative sort of emotional experience. And so even if you went into therapy or you did a workshop, that's very ego-based and mind-based. To have something that transforms with the music cue and all, it's incredibly powerful. And so I think entertainment allowed me that same idea of transformation, but in a different medium. And then when reality came along, for me, it was like, oh, I could create shows that could take real people and transform them, not just for camera, but forever in a very short period of time. And that became what I'm known for, is transformative TV. So whether it's a makeover show and a woman who's hated her body for a decade, and then she comes for my show for 3 days, and I have 3 days to shift the way she sees herself, or a family in crisis like with Super Nanny, anything where there's an authentic, positive transformation, that's what I do.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not just for camera. In fact, everyone who's ever worked with me would say, what's the speech Riaz gives before, is that if the person changed for camera, you all failed. They have to have transformed forever, and the camera's documented that journey. Mm-hmm. And again, the audience knows the difference. Mm-hmm. They know the difference between something that's real and something that's manufactured for television. And so reality as authentic, transformative really became what was my lane, this transformation.
And it does tie into your desire to help people and be a doctor, right? I mean, like you wanted to help people and be a doctor, and now you're helping people kind of change their lives, hopefully for the better.
And it's funny, I just saw a producer I know who did some not so credible shows, put out a post on LinkedIn saying that the whole state of the world now is based somewhat on reality TV, this sort of conflict. And he was like, we all put out shows we were not proud of. And I was like, I never did. I remember a moment in Texas. I was doing a show for MTV. There was all these executives, an expensive show. And it was this hidden camera show about the kids were picked last, being able to show everyone that they have worth. And so it really was about taking these people picked last and letting them have their moment where the school sees them and appreciates them. And one of the executives at MTV said, I want you to pull this prank on the head football guy. And they wanted to take apart his truck. What they didn't know was the truck was given to him by his father, who died 6 months prior. So I was like, I don't think it's a good idea to take apart the truck that is the legacy from his father who just died. Mm-hmm. And
that's like killing John Wick's dog in John Wick Chapter 1.
Yes. I mean, it's a pretty horrific thing to do. And I was like, I don't think it's a good choice. I remember the executive look at me, and he's still in TV, and he said, I know you feel morally that this is wrong, but you'll eventually get used to it. Everyone does. And I looked at him and I said, no, I won't. That's not who I am. And I have never done a show that left people worse. I've never done a show that just took ordinary people and messed with their lives for entertainment.
Yeah.
And many people did. And I would have made much more money if I had done one of these large shows that just fucked with people. And I could not do it because my intention always was, how can I transform for the better? Mm-hmm. And so when shows came to me that were like, and then we'll put them on an island, and then they'll all, we'll fuck with them, and they'll vote each other off. I'm like, I can't. That's not me. That's not what I do. And so this idea of transformation, like I was going to do with being a psychiatrist, is very much the North Star of what I do. Mm-hmm. It has to have that. And I remember this executive was like, everyone gives it up for the money. And I was like, I don't think that's me.
I have a similar kind of North Star. My goal a long time ago. So I worked for the New York Times for like 10 years, covering China. Yeah. And the paper was very different back then. Now it's kind of too political.
Entertainment?
Yeah, it's disgusting. But back in the day, it was like a real paper. And I really respected the writers that I worked with, who I covered China with, because I felt like they were really stand-up gentlemen, all men actually, but at the time. But I loved it. So when I transitioned out of being a photographer and a writer and things like that, a journalist, I really wanted to make television shows that wouldn't make people dumber. Like that was my
story. Yeah.
I really just wanted to I wanted to have fun, go out and do something extreme like an adventure, but also educate, right? And I think like if you're going to ride a motorcycle around India, you're going to see a lot of India. You can plan a lot of things around. You're going to visit. You're going to learn. Like there's lots of different religions there. Why? There's lots of different ways of life. Why? And there's lots of chaos on the road. Why? Like I just wanted to try to bring this out so that people can watch me survive in India, but also learn a ton about India. That's just one example. But I really just wanted to go out and make TV that wouldn't make people dumber, and avoiding sensationalism and avoiding those producer notes of like, okay, like tonight your donkeys are gonna escape, and then tomorrow you have to carry all your stuff to the next camp. It's like, well, no, like that wouldn't happen because the donkeys are tied up and our guides know what they're doing.
Yes.
So adding in all this bullshit is just bullshit, and the audience knows it's bullshit, but they're just not voting with their controllers and getting out of this like negative feedback loop.
It's funny. It's the thing about everything in the screen, and I think people forget this when they look at the screens, is that it's all an edit. the news article you read, the video you shared, even our screen world depictions of ourselves are edits.
Mhm.
And behind every edit is always an intention. And the intention almost all the time now is more likes. It is not to give people transformation. It's not to make people, it's literally, what can I do? How can I bend? How can I twist to get more likes?
Everything is clickbait.
Everything's clickbait. And so I think an audience feels that now, is that everything is just keeping my attention extracted. And so it's so important to find shows. And I think that's why people are going to the creator economy, is because they're like, oh, here's something that's interesting, that the intention is not just to get more and more ad sales. It's okay, here's an interesting, quirky habit that this person happens to follow that now other people are following because of their genuine enthusiasm for that hobby. And I think that authenticity is what resonates the most now. In a clickbaity screen world, the authenticity of transformation resonates.
Yeah, I believe so too. Yeah, there's huge followings of people on YouTube who are just doing authentic things because they love it.
Super random things. Like this woman, I had a friend staying with me, and she's followed this woman who makes blankets and all, but not with crochet needles. Like, she does it on her hand. She has hundreds of thousands of followers. And I'm like, what a specific random thing. But she's so passionate about it that now this friend of mine is now making blankets herself. I think that that's contagious. I think the thing about humanity is we always want to see a bit of ourselves in the other person. That when you do a travel show, you're taking an audience along with you. It's not just your show. It's your show as you being the surrogate for other people going through that experience. And I think that's what people feel now, especially in a screen world, is I'm sitting here alone in my home doing Zooms all day. What moves me? What do I feel like I can go along with someone? I can see myself in them and them in me. And that, I think, has real value now, as opposed to just conflict.
Well, yeah, and I think people find value in that authenticity now because the pendulum has swung too far.
Yes.
Because these executives out there have abused us for too long with just garbage.
The executives, the politicians, the tech people, I mean, all three of them make more money in conflict. I remember asking three very, very high-profile people. One was a media executive, one was a tech executive, one was a politician, lobbyist. Do you make more money with an angry population? And I said, I'm going to ask you multiple choice. A, yes. B, no. C, it's more complicated than that. And so I gave them a get-out-of-jail-free card with C. And I asked the lobbyist in D.C., very powerful lobbyist, and the answer without hesitating was A. And he said, we never even allow the illusion of collaboration to get out. Because behind the scenes, they are collaborating. But we never let cameras in. Because if we show collaboration, that doesn't fire up the donors. And the donors have to be fired up 365 days a year. And I asked an executive at a very large media conglomerate, and I said A, B, C, and she said A. And she said our bonus checks from 2016, 2017 were so high because of the meltdown after the election that she said I didn't cash mine for several months because I knew how far we pushed society into rage and anger to get those checks. And then I asked a tech executive, and he said A. And he said, which he pointed out that only two industries call their customers users, drugs and tech, that they're not customers, they're users. And so everyone makes more money with an angry, divided, rageful population.
And that's what we've got in America.
And that's where we've got. It's not just America. Every country's having this unprecedented polarization because we know algorithmically, if you like X, you'll get more and more of X until you believe X is the only truth. And the person on the other side is getting Y. And so you have it in France, you have it in Germany, you have it in all over. Like, everyone's feeling this unprecedented polarization that's coming from screens, but it's not true. It's an illusion of the screen.
Just got to break through.
Yeah. More sitting in person. That's the only way.
I think so, right? I think actually the rejection of all this negativity and fear and conflict-based content out there is part of why podcasting has risen so fast. Because, you look at a podcaster, they're usually not angry people, and they're usually people who want to listen and people who want to be educated. Like, you look at people like take a look at like Joe Rogan. So he's done more than 2,000 podcasts.
He's one of the OGs.
Yeah. So, and I just think, like, regardless of how smart or educated you were on podcast number 1, by podcast number 2,150 or whatever he's at now, you'd have to be so much more intellectually aware after having more than 2,000 conversations with other really smart, motivated, intelligent people, that now you are like a vessel for all of these people and all of this knowledge that you now have to carry with you into every conversation. And you just think about how useless like television news broadcasters are, or how politically aligned certain broadcast channels are and their hosts and stuff like that. And then you look at someone who's talked to over 2,000 really interesting people and has his or her own opinions. And it's like, that's the only place you can really get truth in him. Not saying Joe Rogan's a truth sayer. I mean, he's all kinds of crazy shit. But you have to find your own people, your own voice, because there's a lot of people doing this. But it's almost like this is the last place where you can get opinions without agenda.
And an authentic conversation, because everything else is edited. If you go through the eyes, you have milliseconds to get someone's attention. If you go through the ears and it lets them drive or cook, you have time. And I think even if you're splitting your focus and you're cooking in your podcast, you're witnessing an authentic connection, an authentic conversation. And I really believe in a world of edits that authenticity has value. And so going through the ears as opposed to the eyes gives you a longer runway. And that has the conversations become longer. And it's not just soundbite, teaser, rejoin, soundbite.
Mm-hmm. Well, the interesting thing about YouTube is, so for example, some of my podcasts, they might only get like a few hundred views, right? But people are listening or watching to them for like over 40 minutes at a time, which is amazing. But then you have another podcast, maybe it gets 10,000 views, but then, the average person is only tuning in for 1 or 2 minutes.
Yeah.
So it's just like, why is again, it's this like clickbait culture of like more isn't necessarily better value.
No, and we do it. I mean, I'll look at Instagram or I'll look at TikTok and like 30 minutes passed by and I probably looked at 4,000 different posts. None of them resonated because it's just the nature of it. And I think our attention span is getting shorter. I think it's having impact on us as a society, that it's very hard to just sit and be present without reaching for your phone or doing something else. We live in a world of a divided attention. And so I always say to people that when you want to connect with someone, connection requires presence. And if we're all dividing our attention, it's very hard to connect, which is why we're in this unprecedented, not just an epidemic of middle management, but an epidemic of loneliness and isolation, is because we are not present to connect. And I think it has real impact on our daily lives because people want that. We're hardwired for it. There's no way around it. And so in these conversations that take more time, I think people feel that. They feel like something real is happening, and that always will have value.
And it makes you feel great. Like,
yes.
Like actually connecting with someone face to face, it releases endorphins. It releases...
It's why we're here on this earth. It's literally why we're here. We're not here necessarily to get a G6 jet. We're here to connect. And I feel like that we've lost that to a degree.
A production jet would be nice, though.
A production jet would be really nice. Although every time I know people who have jets, at some point it becomes an unbelievable burden. Like they got it because they thought it'd be great. And then at some point it's the logistics of having a jet. I would rather fly first commercial if I had to. Having a jet itself, every time I've ever met anyone who had one, at some point they let it go. It's like buying a boat. Like there's some saying that the 2 great days of a person who buys a boat is the day he buys it and the day he sells it.
Well, I have had a nightmare over the last decade and a half of traveling through commercial airports all around the world with truckloads of camera equipment. And this is the real key, batteries. So
batteries, yes. Oh, I know.
Yeah.
I get pulled aside all the time.
But so my shows, I have to go out for 2 weeks without charging. I'm out in the wild for 2 weeks. So we had an entire suitcase of lithium batteries because we would have to charge them up and then go and sometimes we would bring a generator, but sometimes we couldn't. Like in Papua New Guinea, we went for like 10 or 12 days and we couldn't carry a generator with us. We only had these Papua New Guinean guys that were just ripped, but they carried all our camera stuff, but we couldn't carry a generator. So we had to pack batteries for like a 10-day shoot. And that's a shit ton of batteries. So, and trying to go through airport security.
We're on a TSA list. You are absolutely on a TSA list. Though here's the guy with the suitcase of batteries, lithium batteries. Yes.
And then there was always an argument between the airline and the security at the airport, which are 2 different things.
Yes, they are. So they do not work together well. No.
Because if the airport security guy says this guy has like 30 lithium batteries in a suitcase, do you want to let him on board? It's actually up to the pilot.
It's up to the pilot.
Yeah. And but some of these guys were so proud, and especially in parts of the Middle East or Africa, like they were so proud at the security that were like, we're not going to check with the airline. I said no, and no is no. And it's like, well, I can't get on my plane. Like, I can't leave like a couple $1,000s worth of batteries at the airport and then go to my shoot with no batteries.
You make a very good specific case for needing private aviation. Yes, you with your potentially explosive bag of batteries, I think you're probably better served by private aviation.
Maybe, but definitely not in the budget. But okay, so you come out here, you work for WME. It's an absolute nightmare. You transition into setting up your own company with another
for someone first, which did Gosford Park. I worked for him first, and then at that point, when I was like not done well by, I was like, I have to set up my own company.
And what was your vision of setting up your own company? Like, where was where was the niche that you wanted to be in, like at that early stage? Because you just come out of this, like, it sounded like a traumatic WME experience.
Yes.
And that experience might have turned people off entertainment forever.
Yes.
But
and
then
the amount of people who were my coworkers there who left entertainment forever.
Yeah.
There was someone who came in for her first day, left at lunch, and was never seen ever again because she was like, this is not what I want. Because now suddenly you're in it.
Mm-hmm.
And then after that, I went to go work for one of the clients, and then did Gosford Park and did not get a credits. That was strike number 2 that I was like, okay, this world is horrible. And then I decided to start my own company. At the time, my vision was independent film. This was very different, late 90s. It was the heyday of independent film. I had spent about a year and a half looking for funding, found funding from a home and office security company based in Memphis, Tennessee. That will be relevant in a second. And so spent a year and a half finally going back and forth with this very large privately held company. They want to do a lifestyle investment, negotiated everything. We decide we're done, we're going to sign. They say, come to the 21 Club in New York City. We're flying in, let's have dinner. And I was like, great, this is it. I've been working for a year and a half. And then they call me and they say, we landed late, why don't we have breakfast? And I said, that's not a problem. The day that they called me was September 10th, 2001.
Oh, fuck.
September 11th happens, I'm downtown, see the towers come down. The smell is the thing I always tell people is I will never forget is the smell. Home and office security company. Their clients, including American Express, are in the towers. So they call me, breakfast is off, give us a minute. A week later, they're like, we don't think we can do anything. Everything was off the table. And then we entered into the war. It was the same time as the dot-com fallout. And I remember sitting there and I'd hired several people with seed funding. So I had 4 people working for me. And I was like, okay, we've had 9/11, we have the dot-com fallout, we have the recession, and now we have the war. Like, what the fuck is going on? This is the worst time in history to start a company, except for then, I guess, 2020. And so at that point, I had people on staff that I was liquidating my own savings with each of them saying, how much is your rent this month? And I was writing them. So my savings were liquidated. There was no money to be found anywhere. Yeah. And then a friend of mine and I had lunch. Someone had worked at it was William Morris at the time before it merged with Endeavor, and said he was at AMC. And he said, I'm going to get fired. He was going to get fired if he didn't come up with a show. A reality show was brand new. And I said, well, people always have the fantasies based in a movie. I could be James Bond. I could be Rocky. Why don't you train them to become that fantasy and then shoot it on 35 millimeter like the film so they step into their fantasy? So he calls me the next day and he says, my boss wants to meet you. And I was like, oh, no, it was the idea I was giving you. It wasn't something. And he said, well, do you want me to cancel the meeting? And I thought, okay, no, I just have 3 days to learn everything about television. And so I really prepared, and then I went and they gave me a small amount to do a pilot. And that's how I became a showrunner. And then that got picked up. And so I never worked my way up in TV. I started as a showrunner. And so that idea of wish fulfillment was the first one. And then I realized, oh, people who go through these experiences can have unbelievable transformative experiences. And that's when I shifted to reality. And so my original vision was scripted and filmed. And then I ended up in television, unscripted. And that's such a lesson to people. Like, have a path, but be very open to the other things, because I love what I do. It's so fulfilling to create this experience and then watch a real person go through it. And we don't know, when we're sitting in Video Village, we don't know if it's going to work. Like, will this person who's hated themselves for 15 years, can we change them, really change the way they see the world? And so it's very thrilling to sort of be there and be like, did they go on the journey? And so I did not envision this as my career. It was a very different vision. And so now what I do is incredibly lined up with who I am. And I don't know that scripted was as much. And even now, I don't love going to movies. I much prefer the relationship with television, the ongoing week after week. What can you try? What can you do? I love that intimacy that you're in the home. There's a validity for going to the theater. Not my escape. I prefer sort of television. And so I ended up in a completely different genre than I started.
That's amazing that you started off wanting to do independent film and then you ended up in reality-based transformative television.
Yes. And I think it's you just have a vision, but be flexible, because things will present themselves. And if you're too rigid, you won't see it. And that whole experience of how I ended up, it was complete happenstance. If 9/11 hadn't happened, I would have had my funding. I would never have ended up where I am now. And I wouldn't change any of it. I absolutely know why I'm doing what I'm meant to do in this world. Like, there are days I go to work and I'm like, oh, you are doing exactly what you're supposed to do on this earth.
It's funny how these like global situations or pandemics or wars or dot-com crashes or 9/11, it's funny how they can trigger like a rebirth or a complete kind of overhaul of how we see ourselves creatively. And then it can push us into a whole nother avenue. So like, in 2008, for example, I was a photographer in China. I was doing some writing as well, but I was working like every day. Like as a freelancer, I was doing like 250, 300 paid work days a year, which is unreal because China was such a hot topic. The Olympics in Beijing 2008.
Yeah.
And that was the crest of the wave before it collapsed because in 2008 September, Lehman Brothers collapses, right? Housing crisis hits. People are losing their homes, losing their jobs. There's just absolute Armageddon.
Yeah.
And one of the very small caveats of that whole experience was the print publishing industry got destroyed. So Time Magazine, Newsweek, Forbes, Fortune, New York Times, they all went from paying like up here as a day rate to paying like way down here. And I went from making a lot of money to making no money. So from like mid 2008 to early 2010, my entire career in that print media world was destroyed. And it became where you couldn't make a living anymore. And all my contemporaries who I worked with in that time, they are basically not shooting anymore unless they're doing wars. Like some of them have been in Ukraine off and on for the last little bit, but they all went into education. And I was like, I don't want to educate. I want to keep making shit and keep meeting amazing people and keep being inspired by the world. So then
That's its own education.
Yeah. And then I was like, well, I need to come back and like try to make television. So that's the transition I had to make in 2010. But it was completely because of the financial crisis. Because if that crisis didn't work, I was making really good money as a freelancer. I would have probably just kept doing that because it was great and I knew everyone. And then instead I was forced to change. And then that set me on like another decade and a half journey, which then COVID disrupted, right? And then now it's like, how do we all get back into this space after COVID with the risk and the middle management epidemic that we're into? And where is the money? Where are the eyeballs? And how do we make it all bring together? And everything is so different than it was in 2019.
I think there's a message of hope here because I do feel like, especially if you look at your phone, it's all dark and hopeless all the time. Is that in these moments, inflection points, there's always opportunity. And I think we sometimes don't see it because we're clinging to what it used to be. And I think one of the lessons as I get older is you have to adapt or die. And I think that there's always opportunity there. And to anyone listening to it, I think even when it feels like there's nowhere here, there's always some next step. And all you have to do is one foot in front of the other to end up, again, whether I pivoted from scripted to unscripted, whether now I'm pivoting from screen worlds to real world experiences, I think it's always there. I'm still doing what I love to do. And in fact, if I'm really honest, the screen process started to get very boring for me, that it was 17 layers of notes. And I was like, okay, now what I was creating that was really authentic in the real world has been re-edited, said all that authenticity is gone. And now what I'm doing, it's keeping that authenticity in the field in a way that I loved. And so there always is a pivot. It's just, you may not know exactly where the path goes, but just one step after the other, you will end up in a place that you didn't see.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that can be very hopeful to people who don't know what the next thing is no one really knows what the next thing is. It's just moving one step in front of the other.
Do you remember how many proposals did you have in for Quibi?
Not one. No, that's an excellent question.
I had three, and we were chatting about it, and then like 2 months later, they're gone, right? Like,
yeah.
I love how these next things come out. Like, we're gonna make really high quality TV, like 3 minutes, 5-minute episodes, all this stuff. I was like, sure, I'll throw in that. So someone reached out to me. I sent in a whole bunch of stuff, and then 3 months later, the company's bankrupt. So
completely bankrupt. I mean, if we'll talk about what's CNN Plus, like that lasted like 4 minutes. It is. I think I'm naturally. Probably get this from my mom. I'm naturally a little bit more suspicious of anything that is too much money too fast.
Mm-hmm.
Like my head always is like, this is not sustainable. So I'll always sit there, and I remember Quibi where everyone was pitching Quibi, and there was other ones I can't even remember. And I'm always like, I'm gonna wait. I'm gonna take a beat for a minute and watch where this goes, because there's always something new.
Mm-hmm.
But it doesn't change. That's the distribution. It doesn't change the product. The product has to still make sense. And I remember with Quibi, it was like 3-4 minutes, and people pivoting ideas and twisting them in a way that like were 3-4 minutes, but it didn't naturally suit the format.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, it just disappeared. CNN Plus just disappeared. I mean, half the streaming and half the networks will just disappear.
I mean, at least give the storytellers a full act.
Yeah.
Out of 3 acts, right? At least give them 1 act to carry you along in some vision of some story. And you can't do that in 3 or 4 minutes. Like you need a half an hour sometimes to get through an act of character development and story development and emotions carrying the characters and stuff like that. I just don't understand how these short stories were supposed to actually carry any kind of weight.
Snapchat didn't last as sort of a way to sort of create stories. What is another one? There's one that had like, it was 3 seconds. What was it called? It was another one of these where it was like 3-second things and it blew up and then it went away. Yeah, I think especially now in a world where we're scrolling so fast, taking a beat and getting engaged in a story and a dynamic and a conversation, people need, because that's where the escapism comes from. You need to have enough time to connect that it's called transportation in psychology, that I'm not in my own life, I'm in someone else's life watching someone. That's why entertainment has its function, is that it is an escape. And you can't create that escape unless it's fully resonant. And you can't do that in 2-3 seconds.
I agree. Like, one of my favorite things to watch on YouTube now is actually these guys that go hiking and climbing all around the world. And that's what I did with my crew, right? But they're actually doing it by themselves. And they don't talk. They just record ambient noise and have nice music. But these like, they put these clips together and they're hours long. And I just sit and watch them because the music's nice. The scenery's incredible. I don't have to listen to someone talk. So I can just kind of like enjoy the scenery. And it's almost like putting yourself in that position and just letting it go. And I was like, what a great little fresh genre that never would have arrived without YouTube, right? Because no one would put a TV show on National Geographic where no one's talking for an hour and someone's just walking through beautiful space to nice music, right?
No, that's not going to work.
Yeah. So it's been interesting, like how tastes have changed, and I've seen my own tastes change around what I'm watching, and now I'm just trying to see like if I can keep making the shows I made pre-COVID, or whether I need to drastically kind of change where I think my audience is, or what they might want to watch.
What are any changes that you're thinking of incorporating in the stuff you do?
Well, I'm thinking about making like a full shift to YouTube. Like I think that's now my audience numbers aren't great and the podcast numbers are okay. We just got started, and I've put other kind of episodes of shows on YouTube as well, and people watch them. But not to the point where it's sustainable financially, or to the point where it would garner a budget to go into production again. But then I'm pretty good at raising money from corporates, and I'm pretty good at doing that. So I'm thinking about just giving up entirely on the traditional televisions or the streamers, and just going like basically 100% into YouTube and trying to get corporate backing off the back of that. I
think that's an incredibly smart idea. Again, whether it's I think they're adding unnecessary steps because they don't know what to do, the streamers and the traditional cable. I know people who have pilots now, and most people I know who have huge production companies either have pivoted entirely or doing something different, but because the level of fear is higher, rather than trusting or taking bigger swings, they're taking less big swings, and so there's steps, there's more cumbersome. It's just become unsustainable to create something because they want as much security as they can get, but at a certain point, there's no data that's going to say it's going to work. Like, you can get Chris Hemsworth, and it's still not going to be seen. And so I think really pivoting to fully independent, full produce is the only way forward.
And building your own audience.
Yeah. Because then there's loyalty there. There's no loyalty to a brand. It really is to the person and to the project itself, which is kind of a nice shift, because you would have like an MTV or an AMC carrying this brand, and it was so specific what they would do and what they wouldn't do. And now I think you have the opportunity, although there's more sort of, you have to break from the clutter, there's more opportunity to do exactly what you want to do and build something entirely original than having to make it fit into one of the boxes, which we always had to do when we pitched. I remember taking out a show and it'd be 7 different versions for 7 different networks, because then there was one that really I liked, but the others I had to adapt because at the time TLC wanted this, and they always use the word buckets. Buckets and layers of an onion, industry speak that I hope I never hear again. Anytime you do, it's like layers of an onion. We want to hear layers of an onion. And you're like, oh, for God, stop with the onion metaphor. And the other's buckets. Every network's like, we have 4 buckets. We have big competition. We have shiny game floor. We have love. And so we'd all adjust what was the right idea to fit into one of the buckets. And now I like the fact that when we're doing things that are direct to consumer, that we don't. It may take a little while to find the audience, but a network's not putting any marketing dollars in your season 1 ever. And they're certainly, most of the time now, they're doing 1 episode, launching it without marketing as a special, realizing it doesn't have an audience, and then killing the project entirely. Because if you don't tell people about something, it's unlikely they'll find it.
I mean, I had a series once where we shot 10 episodes in 10 months in 10 countries, and we did like 10 expeditions. So we did like these 10 2-week. It was an epic show, but they had forced us to film in a few countries that weren't that exciting. And then, and then they did absolutely no marketing behind the show at all.
Yeah.
But then we won 6 Asian Academy Awards for television, which I did the project out of Asia, and we won 6 of the, and then because there was no marketing or anything like that around the launch or around the awards, they didn't even greenlight a second season.
Yeah. By the way, your Canadian only comes through when you say projects.
Projects.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. No, it's and it's funny how, America, it used to be the beacon of entertainment worldwide, and I think that's much less so. I have friends who are in fashion, and they're high-end fashion, and like we don't even really think about Hollywood anymore. We have our Middle East clients, we have our Asia clients. We don't really think of LA and Hollywood as being an epicenter anymore, and it's really not. Certainly some large movies, but in general, I don't think that you have the dominance that we had 10 years ago. Of if it came from LA or it came from Hollywood, it was a different level of accepted and watched. It's not true anymore.
Yeah, and there's a lot of international movies, like what's going on in South Korea and India, and how those shows are now penetrating. Like, did you see Parasite?
I never did. It's slightly disturbing, isn't it?
Well, no, like Squid Games and stuff like that are shows that I have difficulty watching. But Parasite, I just felt like, I mean, it was all Korean, so you're reading subtitles and stuff like that. But it was just genius.
Okay.
Like, yeah.
I think I'm confusing Squid Games and Parasite, and I don't like watch. My kids are young. I don't like to watch very disturbing stuff. But no, I will watch Parasite.
Parasite's disturbing, but it's not violent.
You see this creativity that comes, and it's funny because Hollywood will run and chase it, and then they'll try and replicate it. And you're like, no, the thing that you just chased was the originality, and now you're trying to replicate the thing that was original, and it's not going to work.
Yeah.
And so suddenly you see like 17 versions of Squid Games out there, and 17 versions of Riaz, and you're like, oh no, this is the chasing thing. It doesn't work.
Well, they'll spend the next 10 years destroying that.
Yeah.
And then they'll be like, oh, it doesn't work anymore, and then they have to find something new.
Yeah. No, it's I've never seen the exodus from LA, and I think it's, again, there's a moment of opportunity here. Is that I talk to people constantly who want to get into entertainment, and now my advice is I don't think you have to move here. I really don't think you have to move here. In fact, there's disadvantages to moving here. It's obviously high cost of living. There's a lot of people doing this. Like, if you could do what you're doing and create shows and projects in Chicago or Milwaukee or Dallas, or like, you might want to do that rather than having to live here and be in this crowd where I don't think you have the green light power that you had 10 years ago.
Well, Mr. Beast had created his own studio in North Carolina.
That is, a friend of mine ran It's funny, a friend of mine ran the production company that Mr. Beast set up, which is Night Studios. And they said, okay, we have this great brand. We're going to now try and pivot and sell to traditional networks. And they folded it 2 months ago. And it was like, why? Like, he was doing this amazing thing. His revenue was insane. And he's like, I was trying to get on these networks, making me jump through hoops to get 1/10 of the audience I already have. So they folded the whole thing because they literally set up an LA office, and it didn't make any sense. The originality wasn't there. And he's like, the layers of hoops I have to jump through to get something out there when I've been doing it, it didn't make sense. And so I do think that we're not location specific the way we used to be.
Well, also too, the Mr. Beast thing is very interesting. So here you got this kid, and he's been, posting videos on YouTube since he was like 15 or something. And he's completely dedicated and bought into YouTube as a platform, even when it wasn't a monetizable platform, which is something I didn't do. Like, I always thought like being in television was where to be because that's who pays you, right? And I think like COVID really started to shift that, because now you got a lot more creators and you had a lot more people doing interesting stuff on YouTube. Like, YouTube has exploded in the last 5 years, right? It's even doing more viewership than Netflix. And I think they paid out like $6.5 or $7 billion to creators last year alone. But even still, like this kid, Jimmy, Mr. Beast, even still with all this success, he's still like, but people won't take me seriously unless I'm on a traditional broadcast network. And then he builds this production company, and then it's a huge failure because the model of all these traditional television partners is so flawed. And it's just not as streamlined. Whereas he can do his own stuff on his own channel, totally streamlined. He's been doing it for a decade or more. Everyone's in the right place. He can probably execute incredibly efficiently. And here he is wasting all this time trying to do like some deal with Amazon, which I think he did. Which I don't know if that's been a failure or not. But again, it's just like he's probably better off just staying in his lane. But at some stage, there was something in the back of his mind is like, ooh, I need to get some legitimacy by being on television, which is bullshit now.
I mean, the Emmy Awards are nice and people wear pretty dresses, but it's sort of like that. Even the audience for watching the Emmys has gone down precipitously. It's all liability with large corporations. I remember we were doing a show, this was a while ago, pre-COVID, where we found these experts that would de-radicalize people, whether it was someone who was drifting to, white supremacy, or someone was drifting towards terrorism. It was fascinating. And when we brought them to a network, a very large network, part of the NBC Universal family, said we were very interested, they gave the experts these contracts, and they were insane. The contracts basically said, we own you, we own your children, we own everything you ever say, we own every product you ever come up with. And I was like, no one with any legitimacy, which we need the legitimacy to bring them on the show, is going to sign away their entire life. It's called the Bethany Frankel contract, by the way, because Bethany Frankel, who did Real Housewives, they didn't give her this contract. And then she did Skinny Girls and made millions and millions and millions that they had no participation in. So now, since that, everyone gets the Bethany Frankel contract.
That's like the life rights.
That's the life rights. Not just life rights, but if you come up with a product 2 years from now, we still participate in it. Who would ever sign that? And so the project fell apart because I said, we want these people because they're legit and they have enough traction that we want to focus on them. But if the traction that they've built on their own, we're now asking for ownership of, to be on a pilot, not even if serious, there's no way they're going to sign it. And I remember having lunch with the head of business affairs, who I'd known for years. And we had lunch, and I said, look, is there anything you can do? Because the project will fall apart. We need it. It's a time of unprecedented radicalism. And he's like, no, because, it's a $2 billion company. They don't care. And so even the liability is stopping anyone from taking a risk. I would say most people would realize that when it happened to COVID, first 3 to 6 months, I think no one knew anything. My husband runs a nursing home, so we were front line. After 3-6 months, there was awareness of how and then it became about liability, and I think in America, that's what runs the show. And it's certainly when it weaves its way into the creative process, it takes out anything that could be unusual or strange or funny or could pop, because that could go badly. That someone could see that and say, I felt uncomfortable in that moment and I'm going to sue you. There was a series of ads for Heineken. I don't know if you ever saw it years ago, where every country they did a cliche. And so like a Heineken truck dropped a case of Heineken, and the Swiss were very neutral about it. And the American was that someone was drinking a Heineken watching a sports event, and someone stood up to cheer the sports event and they bumped into someone, and someone says, I'm going to sue you for bumping into me. And then someone across the bar says, I'm going to sue you for interrupting me. And that's what we are known for. You weave that into the creative process, and you don't have a creative process. You have literally a fear of anything that's different or unusual. And that in large companies, large networks, runs everything. No one knows this. When I deliver a final cut, networks signed off on it, it goes to business affairs. And they do notes as the final, and they say, this should be taken out of context. Let's cut this segment. They look at it for liability. And so the final, if I had anything that sort of connected, conservatives and liberals, they would take it out. They're like, well, if you look at that out of context, if that clip lives, on some social media platform without the context of the show, so take that out. So anything that we would do creatively that pushed the boundaries, the last person who sees the cut is business affairs.
A lawyer.
And they're giving creative notes on what could be too risky.
How fucked up is that?
I mean, come on.
Yeah.
I mean, the worst. And those notes, they're not negotiable. Like when the network gives me notes, we go back and forth. You do this thing called notes on notes, where they send the notes and then we respond with, in bold, our responses to the notes. When you're done, it goes to the business affairs. They are the final say. And then that's what determines what airs.
So what's a show that you made in the past that you're really proud of? Let's break something down that you've done.
I would say one of the shows that I loved it started as a small show. It was called How Do I Look? And it was brought to me, it was an old brand, and it was a makeover show. And when they brought it to me, I said, because my background is psychology, I said the way people present themselves is a result of the way they see themselves. And so I created the segment in the show before we did hair and makeup as a makeover called The Psych of Style, the psychology of style. And it was in the field social experiment would debunk the way the person saw themselves. Because anyone who would present themselves in a certain way and wasn't happy is afraid of something or clinging to something. And so it was a way of debunking the way someone saw themselves. And then at the end of the show, we would make them look differently. A couple of years later, Princess Rima of Saudi Arabia, the Saudi ambassador to the U.S., watched it and said, you are changing women's self-esteem in a very short period of time. They look different, but they walk different. They talk differently. And so I started going to Saudi to create these workshops for people there. We've got 2 Emmy nominations. It was aired in 4 or 5 countries. There was a version in Asia that they launched, a version in Australia they launched. I think it was one of those shows that was very small. It was a network on NBC Universal, but it was so needed because there is, with screens, a real issue of the way people see themselves and present themselves. And so that went on for about 2-3 years. It's a joy to do a show for 2-3 years, and you have the same people you come to work with. You can offer them security. We had like 3 marriages come from the crew. That was one I really, really loved. And I think at that point, it really cemented the idea that real transformation, major transformation, can come in a very short period of time. And I traveled the world with it. It was an incredibly exciting show to do. That was one I really, really, really loved.
How many episodes of that?
72.
Wow.
72. And then we did it. Then Australia launched its version. Then Asia launched its version. And it was, it was very much a format. But the whole idea was, we're not touching hair, makeup, anything until we really change the way someone sees themselves. Because that is the way that the relationship with people in the mirror is one of the most intimate, fixed relationships. It's so hard to change someone's version of themselves. Like, I'm reading Joe Dispenza's book now, where he's talking about the habit of breaking yourself as a habit. And I think people get stuck, that they see themselves, their lives, everything in a certain way. And so if you can hard reset that in a short period of time, it's incredibly fulfilling. And each of those experiments, 72 different experiments we would create, we never knew if it would work. You build this experience and you hope the person has this light bulb moment where they change everything. You never know. And 72 for 72, we did it. But that never stopped the nerves of us all sitting in Video Village, holding hands, being like, will they get it? Will they make the turn? Will they change?
Were there any volunteers or contestants that didn't make it? Like they did,
No.
they all?
They all did.
Yeah.
They all did. And because, I think that's a testament to the producing team, how well we built the experiments. For example, there's a woman who came on who had already been hospitalized for anorexia. That was pretty serious. And her mother brought us to the show and said, she can't see herself accurately. And we're like, okay, you got someone who's young, she's 20, she can't see herself accurately. So we came up with this experiment that because she didn't know her own size, she would, squeeze herself into smaller sizes because she just didn't want to accept who she was. We told her months before we filmed, we need to take a photo of you in your undergarments to send to the wardrobe department so they can pull clothes, because you're going to try on clothes at the end of the show, new clothes. And so we took that photo, we removed the head, we changed the skin color, added tattoos, and photoshopped the undergarments to be a bathing suit. And then we lined it up with 4 other headless torsos, large life size, in the studio. She comes months later with the host of the show. They walk into this large studio, and they see these 5 large headless torsos. And we asked her, which size are you? And she pointed to one that was much, much larger. And we're like, no, that's actually size 12. You're a size 8. We said, which body do you like? And at this point, we're all holding hands in Video Village because we're like, please pick yourself. But we don't know if she will. So she picks herself. And we're like, why do you like that? She's like, I like the way the hips are. I like how slim the waist is. And we're like, interesting. And then the host on camera pulls off the film layer of all the photoshopping. And then we flip the head back up. And we're like, that's you. And there's this moment where we zoom in on the camera and you just see 1 tear, 2 tears. And I'm like, we just proved to you that you don't see yourself accurately. And she's never been the same ever since. That kind of thing to do 72 times in a row is incredibly fulfilling. And I'm in touch with those contestants for years later, and no one went back to the way they were. And so anything that creates that authentic change that lasts is why I feel like I'm here.
And why did that show like that end? You could have gone on forever.
It would be a merger. That at some point, the network, it was Style Network at the time, was folded overnight. And they lumped whatever programming they had, because they started to have programming that was a little bit more mean-spirited. That stuff went over to Oxygen, and anything that was truly authentic and transformative, they got rid of. It's funny, I think that the note I hear the most when I pitch is it's too earnest. It's too earnest. It's too sincere. And I would say in pitches, until recently, my last deal was at NBC Universal. I'm like, can you smell the world burning? Like, from your orbit, can you smell it? You can smell the world burning. Can't we give them a little hope? It's like, nope. What's the twist? What's the hook? What's the water cooler moment? What's the conflict? And you're like, oh my God, literally, the world is burning down and we can't give them any hope. And so anything that's too authentic, too well done, too transformative gets pulled. And then you end up with MILF Island. Have you seen MILF Island?
I have not seen MILF Island, but I get the gist.
Yes. Is that you have the MILFs and then you have their children, and the MILFs start dating the children of the other contestants.
That sounds fun.
Yeah, that's a water cooler moment.
Whose mom is the bigger?
Yep. That's what gets greenlit, not transformative shows.
Yeah.
And so I think the creator economy is the only way to go, because the audience wants it. We know that they want it. We know that it's so funny. It's like you go into these pitch meetings now and the networks still have the same sort of attitude. And I'm like, but you're the gatekeepers, but there's nothing behind your gate. Like, the house is dilapidated, half of it's fallen. Like, you used to gatekeep, an incredible opportunity. Now you don't.
Well, Discovery Warner Brothers are starting to figure that out, right?
Yeah.
Paramount's starting to figure that out. Like, the wheels are starting to come off. Netflix is doing well on share price, but the stuff they're putting out into the world is not
No.
the best. I mean, they've got like obviously like, Baby Reindeer, The Beef, very, original and interesting. But some of their movies are really off the mark.
And they're picking up things for like a fraction of the price since the strike. They're not greenlighting things with high budgets. They're picking up either things that were passion projects they pick up for cheap. They pick up foreign. They pick up things that were previously made and not distributed. So they are bringing down their budgets way, way down in terms of development and production.
Do you remember when Netflix just used to be all comedy, all stand-up comedy?
I remember when it was DVDs you would pick up and then like drop off at the grocery store.
Yeah, I remember that too. But then so I was
Yes. There was.
yeah. So I was living in China, and we didn't have Netflix. And then someone was like, "Hey, you got to get Netflix. It's great for stand-up comedy stuff." And I'm like, "Okay, I'll check this out." This was like 2016 or 17 maybe. And then so I got a subscription and I started. They had like guys like Louis C.K. They had Joe Rogan. He's still an active stand-up comedian. And so I was watching all these stand-ups, and then all of a sudden it was just like bang, quality House of Cards.
House of Cards. That was the big risk. And again, no risk, no reward. But House of Cards, I think 100 million was the budget for it, was like, okay, we're going to really bring back creative, good writing. Because before, the reason reality burst onto the scene is because scripted became horribly boring and play by numbers.
And there was a writer's strike. So you had to do reality because then you didn't have to hire a writer. It was the only way to make content. And that's where someone told me that's where the Kardashians came out of nowhere, is during the last writer's strike, not the one in 2023, but the one
before.
Yeah, like a decade ago or whatever. That was when the Kardashians hit, because everyone couldn't hire any writers and people still needed content. So you just do reality.
You do, and I really think aside from that being a financial model, there were really interesting dynamics. Like pre-reality scripted got super boring, and it was got incredibly high salaries, incredibly high residuals, and they weren't taking creative risks. Then you have reality. And then became this golden era of scripted television where they would use the reality confessional in Modern Family, would bend their plots in a way that was really, really interesting because it had become so staid and so boring. And now I think there's this golden age of scripted television where there's so much stuff to watch, but people don't know what network it is because I got it on Hulu. Could be one of 20 networks. I got it on Amazon Prime. Could be one of 20 networks. It doesn't matter. And I really think that brand loyalty to a network doesn't exist. But people like original ideas. They find it.
Yeah. It's interesting how like a Netflix 10 years ago was like a beacon of quality.
Yes.
And now it's gone just so far in the other direction.
Always true of success? Is that always true that what builds something great, eventually they become the monster that like was the problem in the beginning?
I think the issue with the streaming partners is that they feel like they need to have something new come out every week. And I don't think that's the case. Like, I think there's enough stuff out there for people to be watching that you don't need to kind of have this pressure of coming out with a new show every week. Like if they just came out with like one great movie a month, and really hired the right people, took the time, did the vetting.
Cards, like
then that would be unbelievable. But there's just movie after movie coming out, and I really feel like the movies are the letdowns on a lot of the streaming platforms. But like, Jack Ryan on Amazon, great series, right? I don't know if you read all the Tom Clancy books back in the day, but I love that show. HBO's had a few great hits with Game of Thrones and a few other high quality things. But then, of course, then House of Dragons doesn't even come close to being where Game of Thrones is. And then you've got all these other movies coming out on some other streaming partners, and they just look rushed.
Yeah.
Like, oh, we had to do production in 30 days. It was like, well, why? Because it's not a great product. Like, if you spent 45 days, would it be better? And this movie is supposed to last forever. It's not just some throwaway thing. Like, I'm not watching a TikTok. I'm investing 90 minutes in a feature film with a A-list movie star. Like, it should be better than this, right? And I find that super frustrating.
It should be. And I think they've not figured out, and now it's all being like written, like it's write-offs for large conglomerates, but without ads, they've never been able to recoup the same amount of money. The streaming subscriptions, and now they're cracking down on one house having 17 different accounts. But unless you have the ads in television, it's incredibly hard. And what YouTube does so well is that they go where to the viewers already are. You haven't sold the ads in advance. You're going to where the eyeballs already are, and that's a much safer bet because the streaming services, just as a subscription model, doesn't work.
And for me, I used to do these pre-sales, and then other partners would buy my stuff on acquisition, right? And the problem with that is they never give you the viewership numbers.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, yeah. They used to do this when I used to be in independent film.
Yeah.
You just sold the territory, and they never shared any of the data with you.
Because if it did better, then next time you're going to ask for more, right?
Yeah.
So they want to keep everything on the lowdown. But like when you're watching YouTube, obviously you're geographically, you get all the statistics about age and gender and it's just like, and then you own that and you own the data too. And I think that's such a way more powerful way for if I was 18 years old and I wanted to create content, I wouldn't even bother coming to LA. I would just be 100% on YouTube.
And there's feedback in that. Again, the model we have is you finish the whole thing before you ever get feedback. And the feedback you get is from network executives or a focus group. This is real-time, real-world feedback that this episode did better. Was it the length? Was it the structure? I'll adapt the next one. Did it go up? Did it go down? That kind of real-time feedback is missing from the Hollywood creative process. And you can't create something to an audience and adjust to an audience if you don't listen to their feedback. And with the way that the distribution happens, we don't get any of that. We don't get any of that. It's all done in a vacuum.
And you'd think that having that feedback and having those numbers would help you create the next project in a more sustainable or more cost-effective way, because you're learning as you go, but actually there's no information sharing at all.
And by the time you get to that, where you could apply those lessons, the head of the network's gone, and all the people under them are gone, and then a new person's brought in with a new agenda. So many of my shows never got canceled. They just didn't get picked up because a new regime came in. And the new regime never won success of the previous regime because they don't get credit for it. And so every time you have this, like, here's a new president of production, they got the entire slate, and a new person comes in, and they have their own people.
And that's every 3 to 4 years.
That's even faster now. I think it's like 2 years is the average length. It's incredibly short, which I feel for them. They've got 2 years to turn an entire brand around, and they can't. And so it's you throw out the baby with the bathwater, you try again, then you're just about to learn stuff, and then that person gets removed. It's a real problem, the turnover, the revolving door. And now, I even A&E last week or 2 weeks ago let go of so many of their executives that had been there, and they're less like they're cleaning house.
Yeah. And there's no one else hiring those people.
No.
Yeah.
No. Like, if you were an executive, it's an incredible, I'd say I know 5 executives who have become real estate agents, because that whole skill set of I'm going to give you the feedback that I think the audience wants is not needed when you can actually get feedback that the audience wants.
In real time.
And so and it's funny, this one network executive that I never liked, always such an ass. You'd go to all of panels and stuff and loved being the network and loved people coming up to him. And now he's unemployed and he's making this pivot, and he made this huge push on LinkedIn to sort of put up a video every single day with his inspirational quotes about how to do a midlife career pivot, and it's like 6 viewers. And it's like, no, my friend, this is karma. Like, you were not a very nice person for many years, and now you're trying to reinvent yourself. But we all remember. It was a very different era, but now it's definitely more democratized in a good way. It's a little hard because there's so much out there, but I think you following those hikers who are just doing, if you have an original voice, I really think that matters in the creator-based economy in a way that it was so hard to get those original things through the system.
Yeah.
And you can, and the audiences find it. I don't like Instagram as much because it's pay for play. Facebook is pay for play. You don't get the reach if you don't pay for the ads. But I still think that TikTok and YouTube have slightly more organic growth and reach.
Yeah. I mean, we monetize my Facebook page by putting out snippets of videos and things like that from all my TV shows. So you can monetize the viewership on Facebook the same way you can on YouTube. They'll see some ads and stuff like that as well. It's not too bad, but it's definitely not as kind of dynamic as YouTube.
It's not as dynamic as growth. You really feel like I should be increasing my audience by a certain amount, but it sort of hits this level, and then you keep getting if you'd like to promote this, if you'd like to promote this, if you'd like to promote this, and you're like, where's the organic growth? And they're like, it's not going to be shown on more screens. So it can be monetized, but I don't think it has the free market range, if you will, that TikTok and YouTube have.
So how many proposals do you have out in the market right now? As an executive producer, someone who's running their own production company, someone who's had a great, past track record, how many properties are you pitching around the town right now?
0.
Wow.
So I've made a pivot about 6 years ago, because again, my brand was creating authentic transformation. How could I create an experience that real people would go through and transform, and then cameras would document it? About 6 years ago, now 7, I was like, people are not talking to each other. I did not foresee COVID. I did not foresee where we would be in this epidemic of isolation. I was like, why are people not seeing each other? Why are they not talking to each other? And so I started bringing people together. 2 people, 5 people, 20 people in rural Alaska and Texas, friends of friends, New York City, again and again. And I was like, is there a secret to creating connection between any two strangers? I realized that when you connect to people who already knew each other, that there were many, many dynamics that had nothing to do with the conversation. And I was like, oh, people who already know each other, it's like, you voted this way, you did this, you weren't there in 20 years ago. And so there are dynamics you couldn't get past. But if you could connect strangers in the right way, they could be incredibly close in a very short period of time. And so I created the 60-minute live experience called Connect Effect. It is done at colleges, it's done at conferences, it's done at companies, it's done at community health. We're actually going on Saturday. Essentia Health, the largest healthcare system in Minnesota, is bringing us in because they know everyone's isolated. They know people don't know how to meet each other, and there's no resources for them. So an audience of about 100 people come together into a theater. From the way you come in, the way it's all done, again, my shows were always transformative. They created this experience. It's all very highly produced. And you end up sitting in a pod with 3 people you don't know. And then there's a 60-minute live show. Part of it's in the real world, the people you're with. Part of it's in the screen. It goes back and forth between the real world and the screen world. And in 60 minutes, you become incredibly connected to these people that you've never met before. And so it is a meaningful intervention for the epidemic of isolation and loneliness. So now that was one of my projects 2-3 years ago. Now it's my full-time startup, and it's doing incredibly well because everyone is lonely and people don't know how to meet. And if they can go through a process that, again, is not a deliberative debate, it's not a workshop with all would go through the brain and the ego, but it's entertainment, so it's transformative. Again, same thing, not taught, it's caught. It really does amazing. So we had Essentia Health, their mental health department, run data on our effectiveness. 285 people went through this, strangers. 96% felt more hopeful. Hope is so key. Radical hope is so needed now. 97% saw the other side differently. 95% were able to connect. And 99% would recommend it to other people to go through. And so in this epidemic of loneliness, we're doing it everywhere. So we're doing it in Minnesota. We do Connect Effect 7 to 12 times around the area. And then we have what are called chatty hours. It's a place where people can drop in on connection as needed. My vision is that we eventually have locations. Because now if you are lonely, you are isolated, where would you go? If you go to a Starbucks, everyone's on their screens. You go to a bar, everyone's on their screens. Where do you go? And so not only is it a space, but we actively introduce people based on this methodology we've developed for 7 years that we can connect any two strangers across any backgrounds, any divides, any generation. It really is highly, highly, highly refined. And so we do Connect Effect for a week around Minnesota, and then we have 2 locations where people can drop in for chatty hours for 3 to 5 months. After that, we do Denver. After that, we do Irving, Texas. After that, we do Sundance. And so it really is this need for, rather than people looking at a screen, how can I connect in the real world? Mm-hmm. That's the opportunity. And so immersive real-world experiences is where I'm going, which is essentially exactly what I did, except for cameras used to document it. Now I'm doing it without the cameras.
That's amazing.
It's really cool. We went into Orange County. Neighbors could not sit with next to each other. And after 1 hour, they ended up working seamlessly together. We're brought by an organization that gets people to work together across divides because people realize everything they know about someone is coming from the screen. It's almost like we're looking at each other like this. Mm-hmm. And so you have to hard reset, Control, Alt, Delete the humanity between 2 people. So they're like, oh, anything I know about you is from the screen. I don't know you. And so it literally takes 60 minutes. And it's you walk in, the lights are dim, music's playing, and it's like a show, but it connects the audience to itself. Mm. And so that's what I'm doing. And so we travel with it. It's a team of 7 that arrive and do it. If you saw it, it would be, you're like, oh yeah, this is a TV show just without the cameras.
That's amazing.
Like it's really, really, it's talking to the Surgeon General special advisor, and they said, we've heard so many solutions to the epidemic of loneliness that were apps. And I'm like, that's kind of the problem, is you have people on the screen more. But we've not seen one that's scalable like this. Mm-hmm. And so everywhere we go, we do it, and then people have community. And what I love is people connecting across generations. I think we become siloed so quickly. Like you're an 18-year-old, you're there. You're a 70-year-old, you're there. You're of this socioeconomic status, you're there. We live around millions of people we will never meet. You live around hundreds and hundreds of people that you will never meet.
I don't know any of my neighbors.
There you go.
Yeah.
And so having a place, and ideally the dream is that it becomes a franchise, that you have like, okay, there's the Target, there's the Walmart, there's a Connect Effect. It's called Connect Effect. That's the location, because the Connect Effect itself is if you connect in a meaningful way, it leads to conversation, which is the foundation of community. That's the Connect Effect. But it depends on perfecting that connection, optimizing that initial connection, bringing people together for years and years. The secret to connection is the introduction. Mm-hmm. How you introduce people sets up how they see each other.
That's interesting, because go back like 100 years ago, right? Like where did people go to talk to each other and hang out? Well, it's probably mostly a religious institution
Yeah.
of some stage,
Yeah.
right? Because religion played a much bigger role in people's lives, especially in North America, like 100 years ago. So people would go to church on Sundays,
Yeah.
and they would,
That was your community.
yeah. And then that, that's kind of broken down, and then it kind of became work in the factory and this kind of stuff. And then maybe a little bit later, it was maybe some sports or extracurricular activities. But kind of COVID kind of wiped all that out. And now people don't know where to go to hang out. I mean, it's a very interesting concept.
Not just know where to go, but how to. I mean, I think as people get older, they have less opportunities to meet people. And it's so funny how often I'll talk to someone who's 70 and they will reference, at some point in the first 5 minutes, they'll talk about how old they are because they feel this self-deprecating way to be like, but I'm an old person. And I'm like, oh, that because society, specifically in the West, not in the East, has told you because you're old, you have less value. Like, you're over 50, 60, please exit stage left. Go play bingo or canasta in the corner. You're now an old person. Whereas in the East, you're more revered as you become older. The West is revered. Yeah.
For sure. I mean, like, I lived in China for 18 years, right? Like, Chinese people treat their older generation so well because they've seen so much and they have so much history. Like, the way that Americans treat older people versus the way the Chinese, like, this was a basis for our stories at the New York Times on multiple occasions, just trying to say, like, actually, the older generation is incredibly valuable.
Incredibly valuable. Like, we keep beating our heads like this has never happened before. There's a Ken Burns documentary series about the Vietnam War. And you look like, we've never been so divided. Yeah, we have. Like, look at the documentary series. We're literally divided to the point that at Kent State, students are getting shot by the military on campuses. But every time we have to reinvent the wheel. Like, if you could sit with someone, and when people go through Connect Effect, you can have a 17-year-old who sits next to a 70-year-old. And because of our methodology, they see each other incredibly evenly. In fact, there's a Forbes article that wrote about our methodology, and it called it a game changer. The system is called EPIC, E-P-I-C, and the first step of connection, the most important step, is equalization. How you equalize people shows their commonality. It's like we feel more comfortable with people we have kinship to. That's just normal. So if you can find a way to equalize people across generations and backgrounds, that's the key to connection.
To make sure there's no hierarchy or...
Yes,
no.
And this is the thing we do wrong in the West. We lead with our labels. I'm a 2-time Emmy-nominated executive producer. And so much of what we do when we introduce ourselves is, let me show you my very, very impressive job. Let me tell you about my very, very impressive accomplishments. Hopefully you'll see my very, very impressive car. And ideally, I want you to not just see me as having worth, but ideally a little better, just a little bit better. And that creates no connection. And so the key is equalization. The way to actually see each other and have deep connection that leads to conversation community is equalization. We tend to lead with ego in the West. I always like, what do you do for a living? And in my head, I'm like, okay, if he's a plumber, then I'm better than him. If he's a this, then I'm... And that's a very American way of looking at the world. I think it's now becoming more everywhere. But equalization is incredibly key. And then the second step, EPIC, is personalization. That in a world of infinite edits on our screen, if you and I talk about what we saw on the screen, we will talk past each other because your version of the world on your screen is completely different than mine. And people are constantly talking about what they see on their screens, and then they end up spiraling and there's no connection there. The only truth you know for sure is the truth of your own life. There are no alternative facts when you talk about your own life. And so that's solid foundation for connection. So when people go through Connect Effect, we don't ask them about what they saw on their screens. We have them open up about the stories of their lives over the thousands of days they've lived their lives. Screen always wants now. We don't reflect. It doesn't give us a moment to reflect. Like, we never are caught up. Like with texts and apps and all, there's never a moment you're caught up. And so getting people to equalize and personalize, it's incredibly effective at getting people. I think most people in the world are not mentally ill. I think they're just very lonely and they don't know where to go and they don't know how to connect.
Yeah, no, I feel like this podcast is like a Connect Effect.
Yes. And the whole thing starts by the way you introduce yourself. You have a very good way of introducing yourself and why you want to do it. If you change what you're looking for, it'll change what you see. It's very clear when you reach out what your intention is. I'd like to have a conversation. I'd like to learn from you. We could talk. Everything you send in terms of setting this up is based in that spirit. So I know coming here that I'm not here to impress you. I'm not here where there are podcasts that it's like, okay, like who can one-up each other? That's not. You're very, very equalized in the way that you bring up. So I think the conversations naturally go there.
I'm just here to learn.
Yeah. And we all are. We all should be. I always tell people there's something called a learn-repeat ratio. If in a conversation you are repeating what you know more often than you're learning something new, you're doing it wrong. Like, you're not here to regurgitate what you know again and again. You're here to learn. But if you find yourself in a conversation talking about what you know again and again, you're doing it wrong and no connection can be made.
It's the Bourdain effect. You just got to listen.
Yeah. And most people are waiting to speak. And that's a very, very different skill set.
Absolutely.
And I think what I feel for young people is they're waiting to speak because they're afraid of what they're going to say. because it's an era where the stakes have become so high. If I say the wrong thing, if I use the wrong pronouns, I'm out, and so I think they're very nervous. So when they come to one of our connective experiences, we don't just say we have the space for connection, we have the active mechanism that from the moment you show up at the door, we have someone there to greet you. You touch a touch screen, it assigns you one of 4 colors, and then you go to someone with that hat, and then they start introducing you. And the way they introduce you, it's like all the awkwardness and worry about initial social introductions is outsourced to us. We do. It's like going to a great dinner party where the hosts are introducing you.
Mm-hmm.
So you don't have to worry about how you introduce yourself. And I think that's the biggest concern people have is, even if I walk into a space, will I know anyone? If I don't, I'm going to go down to my phone or I'll walk out. And so at the door, you're greeted and then you're introduced to the next person who's introduced to the next person. It's like a chain reaction. And so you do nothing. You just follow along. It's effortless. And then we integrate you into conversations with people. And I think people need that active mechanism until they can get used to it and get the practice of it.
What percentage of people that you introduce to each other stay in touch after the session's finished?
So it's interesting. So phase 1 was delivered, which is where we go to colleges and conferences and companies and we deliver it. Phase 2 is hosted, where we are now. So what we're doing is we're working with Essentia Health, the mental health department, and working with a researcher at the university that's bringing us in, one of the partners, to study that. Because first was just getting people, reminding them what connection feels like. We just did it in DC, and this 20-year-old came up to me and he's like, I had forgotten what connection was. Because he's like, I play video games, I'm talking to people, but I had forgotten what this is. Like the amount of how nice it's to be, again, 93% of communication is nonverbal. And so it's reminding them. Phase 2 is then, okay, dropping in week after week after week. So when we did it, our first prototype in Minnesota, we did it for 3 months and we had the same people showing up again and again and again and again. So now our goal for the second activation is to increase the numbers, because when people experience it, they come back. It's
And they talk about it with their friends.
And they talk about their friends.
Did you see this statistic that said, like, I can't remember where or how, I won't give an exact number, but like young people in their 20s are having way less sex than like we did 20 years ago or 25 years ago, however old we are. Like the generation that's coming through now in their 20s is so much less social, so much less confident, and so much less desire to connect with people of the opposite sex or people of the same sex. Like, and just that effort or that skill of trying to find a partner is just too stressful for this young generation, and it's kind of like throwing everything out of a whack. And they were relating this not to mental health but to population and birth numbers and stuff like that, and the fact that we're not creating enough people to sustain ourselves in the United States, right? Our birth rate is less than 2.2 or whatever like that.
It's absolutely true. They're not driving. They're not putting themselves in situations that are uncomfortable because, and I get it. It's like if you tell this generation as they're coming up, the world's going to burn up in a handful of years. The air you're breathing now could kill you, so stay home. The level of fear that we've put in them and the level of worry that they see every single day is overwhelming. It's debilitating. There is no hope. And so the first marker we ask people when they go through Connective X is, do you feel more hopeful? And 97%. And that to me is the key, because if you don't have hope, it does not make you put yourself out there. Like it's again, learned helplessness. You learn nothing I do is going to matter. The world's still going to burn up. The political system's going to burn up. Large corporations take over everything. I can't save. Like I'm just going to stay at home and then order in food. It's incredibly, hope is the most needed driver for human beings. And so that's the first thing we measure is how hopeful do you feel? And then ideally through our mechanisms, it's so effortless. You just show up and we've taken you on this process. And it is a new way of dating. Everywhere we go, people are like, I love this because I can meet people. And then if chemistry begins, that's great. But we'll just start with people meeting, because even meetups to date people, stakes are high. You're evaluating a potential partner, whereas now it's just like, I want to meet someone. And if there's something else that happens, that's great. And so we're really trying to reinvent the community center as an entertainment venue, because if it's enjoyable, people will take the medicine. If it's really fun, people will take the medicine. Now everyone keeps saying like, we need to have deliberative conversation. We have to have tough conversations. I'm like, fucking shoot me. If you tell me you have to have one more tough conversation about one, like I'm already self-conscious. Now I have to think about everything I ever talk about is going to be a tough conversation. I'll just stay home. And so I really think to make it and brand it as, this is designed to be entertaining, this is designed to be fun, this is designed to be effortless, is the path that you build for people to reach out for connection. You can't make it any harder. It's already hard as it is. Make it as easy as possible.
It's an interesting transition that you've gone from almost becoming a doctor wanting to help people to then making TV shows that help people. Then now you're helping people become more social and kind of get out of this pandemic era.
It is by the grace of some higher power that I'm now sitting there talking to healthcare systems, and I'm like, oh, this was plan A1, and now we're in plan like D4, and I'm back where I started. Because the thing I always was able to do, which the horrible executive at MTV told me, like, you'll give up, you'll stop caring about wanting people to transform, you'll just go for the money. It's like, no, the thing I'm interested in is the transformation. I was able to make a great living with it. I did really well, but I'm always fighting uphill with a network. They're like, we don't care if people change for the better, we just want ratings. I'm like, you'll get both. Like, if the audience witnesses an authentic transformation, that's going to get them. But they're like, but then I don't have a water cooler moment to tease in my promos. And you're like, oh, for fuck's sake. So the whole thing, it's why all networks are run by the marketing people. They're not run by the creatives. They're run by the marketing. And you're like, it doesn't matter what the show is. It's the billboard. It's the 10-second spot. And that started wagging the dog. And so now I'm back in a lane where I don't, like, I can lead with my intention was I want people to feel good. I want to transform, and I don't have to hide that, which I was always hiding that with the network, that wasn't the primary objective. And now I'm back in a lane where I'm like, nope, I'm talking to the mental health department. I'm like, primary objective is people feel good. That's what I want my entertainment shows to yield, is people feeling really good and hopeful. And it's wonderful not to have to hide that.
Yeah. And you're back in healthcare.
And I'm back in healthcare and entertainment overlapping with healthcare. And I'm in all these lanes with, deans of universities who say all the students coming in want a single dorm. They're afraid to live with someone they don't know. We're in companies constantly where like half of our workforce is work from home. And now when we bring them to the office, no one's talking to each other. In conferences, people are coming together and they're like, we could have Zoomed this. Like, no one's actually meeting. There's no networking. So in all of those, we have the solution to create the mechanism of connection, which is the most important thing, is connection.
I think it's going to be an interesting, I think you're coming at this at absolutely the right time, because you've got like massive companies like Google, Amazon, JP Morgan. They're all saying like 2025, January 1st, everyone's back in the fucking office 5 days a week. No more bullshit, no more Zooms, no more working from home in your pajamas. And I think that in order to get the buy-in from the employees to do the commute, to wake up early, to get dressed, to do everything you need to do to go into work, like the buy-in, it has to be something extra from the companies that they're going to deliver. It can't just be the same experience anymore. Like I was talking to an interesting young man the other day, and he's putting in gyms, workout gyms in all these companies all around the United States. And he's mainly dealing with companies that do manufacturing as a way of like avoiding injuries and stuff like that. Like getting people who lift boxes at Amazon or work at car manufacturing companies, like getting them fitter so that there's less workplace injuries, because workplace injuries have huge insurance consequences. So by having a gym and having a certain portion of your employment staff doing like a daily workout routine can reduce corporate insurance massively. So he jumped onto this right away, and he's been doing this. And he said the thing that he didn't figure out was the community element of it was stronger than the desire for physical exercise. And he was saying like everyone wants to be fit, but actually employees coming together, sharing 30 minutes, 45 minutes together, sweating, doing something athletic was actually more important, he thinks, to their mental health than maybe the like being stronger. Yeah.
Absolutely true. I mean, remember the insane growth of WeWork was based on the promise that we'll build the space and the space will yield the connection.
That's one of my favorite television. Did you see We Crashed on Apple?
Yeah. But it absolutely was true. It's like if we build the space, and now I'm part of Neue House, which is a media house downtown in Hollywood for media people. And they're like, no one is meeting. And I'm like, you need not just the space, you need the active mechanism that's making the introductions. It is the most needed thing in the entire world is connection everywhere. CAA, the largest agency, came to me, not through my agent. They came in a different way, and they said, since war's broken out in the Middle East, we're having massive problems with, our Jewish agents and our Muslim agents, and everything's political all the time. We need something that revitalizes our sense of connection, that we don't have to talk about politics. And I'm like, people talk about politics because the phone is constantly demanding now. We go from tragedy to tragedy to tragedy without a moment to process the moment before. And so it's all we ever talk about is the issue of the day. The Connect Effect reminds you that you come from thousands of days and you end up talking about your life and your history and things. But they came to us and they're like, we have the most powerful agents in the world, and they can't be in a room together. So could you come and do Connect Effect for us? And we did, and they were thrilled with it. And they're like, oh, we feel like now we have a lot in common that we didn't realize, because the screen is designed to show you what's different, and it's designed to show you conflict, because conflict and anger sell. The byproduct of that is that we feel like we have a connection to no one.
Well, conflict and anger sell. Plus, you're dealing with already incredibly insecure people in the entertainment industry, and then they get into this vicious negativity circle, and they can't break out of it. And then you have to come in with your program to hit the reset button.
Yeah. It's everywhere. I mean, we're doing small town Minnesota, then we're doing Denver, Colorado. They're like big, small, 7 years old, 17 years old. Everyone feels a lack of community,
Yeah.
And a lack of connection. And all the solutions that come make me so sad because they're all apps. I was looking at this thing that Tokyo, Japan, was launching these loneliness robots, which you get a robot and it looks like a sort of a dog, and you cuddle it when it tells you, and you're like, oh my God, we are literally creating connection to an AI background. And I'm like, that's not the solution.
Mm.
That's a big Band-Aid. That's not the solution.
But think about how many robots you could sell.
Think how many robots you could sell. But yeah, it's we're not going to rewire thousands and thousands of years of human evolution in the 15 years that the smartphones came out. You're not going to be able to make that pivot.
No.
So you've got to figure out a way to make the allowances for in-person connection that is easy and effortless and enjoyable. Otherwise, you're just going to lose people.
I think it's the enjoyable element that's the hardest. I think because I've had people here in Beverly Hills, like I'll be like, hey, let's catch up for lunch or a coffee. I'll come to you, right? And they're like, no, let's just have a Zoom tomorrow. And I'm like,
Yeah.
but I'm someone that I might want to work with you. You might want to work with me. Like we should handshake and look each other in the eye straight up and see if we're people who can work together. Like when did that not become a priority?
Yeah, 93% of the communication between us right now of this conversation
Mhm.
has nothing to do with the words coming out of my mouth. The information is only 7%, and yet in the screen world, all we do is exchange information. You know, look at this post, look at this email, look at this. It's all information, which is not what human connections made of, and certainly not communication. So I'm with you. And when you said this was in person, I was like, oh, I'm interested. Like if I have to sit in my own desk and do a Zoom where I'm trying to read you, I can't see your foot tapping, I can't see your that's all information, and I'm not getting any of that in that screen. Even if I have your attention the full time, and that's, I'm saying a big if. Most people are not fully focused.
No.
And so I think even the fact that it's curated and guided and effortless is the key, because it's amazing to me. So we do this last thing after 60 minutes. Again, you've gone on through the whole experience of Connect Effect with this pod of 3 people you didn't know. At the end, we say, okay, we're done with what we're doing, so you guys can just now chat. And they stay, and they chat, and they chat, and they chat. At some point, the maintenance people are like, we got to turn over the room. It's a ballroom or something. We got to turn it over. And I'm like, I can't get these people to leave. Like, they just are enjoying this connection. And I find so often that when we connect with people we've known, and especially those we know very well, dynamics get very set. And the joy of connecting strangers is that there's no history.
Mm-hmm.
There's no dynamics. There's nothing but pure potential. And that's very freeing. We found that college students were more likely to connect with people from a college across town than the people they see every day. Because if they see them every day and they do something wrong and it lives on social media, they have to sit in that discomfort every day. Mm-hmm. But the freedom that comes from being connected to someone who's not part of your day-to-day is much higher in a screen-based world. And so
it's safer.
It's safer.
Mm.
It's safer. You know, and I'm just seeing you as you are now. Like, I'm not a friend of yours who's known 20 years ago who's like, you know, you always used to do this, and oh, you're doing that again. You know, we get stuck in that. And the more that we spend, the less time we spend in the real world, the more we lean on these preconceptions we have of each other. You know, who did what in COVID? Who voted for who? Become these real strikes against communities. And you know, we know these lines of divisions go through houses and communities and neighborhoods. And it's very hard to change those dynamics, but so little of it has to do with the issue. It has to do with the dynamic that's set in stone. And so when you connect strangers, there's a real freedom that comes from that.
Yeah, I believe so.
It's really incredible.
It's interesting. Like, as we're all coming back out of COVID, I think we all just have to like recharge our social energy battery, because I think, you know, like, I feel like the bandwidth that we all had during COVID just shrunk, you know, massively, because we weren't dealing with people outside of our immediate family for years.
Yes.
In some cases. And then now we all have to just kind of buck up and start going out into the world again, go to events and go to all these things and meet people, press the flesh, shake hands, you know, not wear a mask, hug people again. Like, I mean, when did all this become something that people didn't want to do?
Even now, when I get an invite to something and I generally enjoy conversation, I think about it. One of the things we ask in Connect Effect is, how many of you were nervous to come here? How many of you feel nervous meeting new people? How many are worried about what you're going to say? And the entire room indicates yes. Mm-hmm. Because, yeah, we're back, but in a way, you know, that it's funny. You know, I think in 20 years, people asking, like, what was it like to live through COVID? And I was like, I remember at the beginning of it, we have family in Hong Kong, and they were talking about a lockdown. And I was like, wait a minute, you don't leave your home? They're like, no. I'm like, I don't understand. You literally don't leave your house? They're like, no. And I was like, well, how do they enforce that? Like, how do you just stay in your home? And then month after month after month after month, I'm like, oh my God, it's so easy. Humans are incredibly adaptive to a new reality. And the problem is we adapted to something that really had detrimental effects.
Well, also too, we adapted to something that some pretty gentle Western democracies surprisingly became incredibly fascist. And like I lived in Dubai, and if you went out at the wrong time of day without permission during that initial lockdown, you could get up to a $10,000 fine.
Yeah.
And in places like Hong Kong and China, sometimes they were bolting the doors in from the outside so that people couldn't leave, which is a fire hazard. And then they even got so fucking crazy that they were killing people's pets. I don't know if you saw that as well, which is a huge no-go for me. Obviously, you saw my cats when we came in. Like, so it's like this. It was this dynamic of people buying in and following the herd, which is always a dangerous thing. And then also too, these governments going like, oh my God, we have all this power.
Yeah.
All of a sudden, like it says specifically Canada, I took particular offense to, even though I haven't lived there for like over 20 plus years. But in the Canadian Constitution, there's an actual clause that says the federal government can never stop transportation of citizens or goods between provinces or states, right? And but during COVID, every province blocked transport between and I have a friend of mine who lived in Montreal, and he had to go to Toronto for a family issue, and he had to quarantine to go to Toronto, and then for 2 weeks, and then he had to quarantine when he went back to Montreal. And I'm like, but you're in Canada, but you're in Quebec, which is the province of where Montreal is, and then you're in Ontario, which is the province where Toronto is, and those were treated almost as two different countries. So I mean, it was just insane levels of bureaucracy.
I mean, you have a friend who visiting me is from Texas. They're like, oh yeah, our COVID lockdown was 2 weeks. Florida was like 2 weeks. And here was like a year. I had friends who drove across the country, and they're like, every place we'd stop, it's like, do you guys have COVID here? Because they didn't know, do they wear their masks or not? And again, I think the truth is always somewhere in between. And for the first few months, no one knew. My husband ran a nursing home. It was incredibly scary.
Yeah.
After a while, it became very obvious that it wasn't as transferable. Reasonable measures worked. And yet, a year and a half later, we had friends visiting family in Hong Kong and in Australia, and they had to quarantine in their room in the hotel for 2 weeks. And I'm like, wait a minute, we know now you can walk through a lobby with a mask on, but no, it was like, nope. If I can make you pay $1,000 every time you come in and out of this country, that is an unforeseen revenue stream. That's amazing. And then it changed entertainment, like we talked about. Pre-productions on Zoom, post-productions on Zoom. You meet people on set when you're shooting, and then no one really knows anyone. There's no chemistry. It's everyone's phoning it in.
Yeah.
And so the creative process was complete, but they're saving a ton. No overhead for office space in pre-production or post-production.
But COVID costs for production sometimes amounted to 20 or 30% of the budget. So I did a podcast a while back with this guy, Sean. He's based here in LA, and he runs a production services company. And they were quick to get on all the COVID and the PPE and the glass and the masks and the testing. And he was like, he made so much money during COVID because he was on set with Sony and at the Universal Studios, and he was doing all of this with his team, and he just made an absolute fucking killing. So he was one of the people that I loved him because he adapted so fucking quickly, and got into that business in a real hurry and made an absolute windfall.
And then you couldn't get rid of that. Yeah. Like you couldn't get rid of that because at some point when it was in, it's very hard to pull it out. Yeah. And so all these productions were like, are we really going to budget 25% of the budget for COVID protocol? And it wouldn't go away. It wouldn't go away. And I'd say, for my husband running a nursing home, it was never about the patients. It was about 4 levels of government fighting for authority: the CDC, the state, the county, and the city. And the CDC would come in and be like, the oximeter is to be here, and the county would say it's over here, and the city would say it's over here. And inspectors coming in and finding them again and again and again. Meanwhile, there's no time to actually look after the patients who, by law, were in their beds, curtain pulled around them, door closed for almost a year.
That's insane.
That's killing them.
Yeah.
And so it was it was never about the patient's well-being. It was about what opportunities there are for finances, or what kind of opportunities are there for... We'll be unpacking this for a long time, but for me, the thing that I unpack now is the impact on human-to-human connection, specifically on younger people who lost a lot of time.
Yeah. Think about all the high school students that didn't graduate high school, all the university student, no prom, like all these kind of beautiful social interactions that we remember for the rest of our lives just got canceled or postponed indefinitely. I I really hope that whatever happened during COVID is not like the 2008 financial crisis, because in the 2000 you had fucking carnage globally, right? But not one bank executive went to jail. You know, and now we're here in COVID, and we've starting to unravel. We're starting to do forensic accounting. We're starting to realize who really profited. We're starting to realize what had to be done, what didn't have to be done. Like, and I'm just wondering, like, where are the heads that are going to roll?
Hey, you know, it's an amazing era of lack of accountability, because again, the screen, I could stand up and smash a glass at you, but that only exists if people see the footage of that, which most people, depending on what they like and not like on their phones, may never see that footage. And so did it happen? And so the accountability, the people who bought in fully for so long will never see the footage that says, well, we've done the forensic accounting, and that will never appear across their phones. And so that reality of there being a change or a variation of what they believe will never occur to them, because it'll never be seen. And so that's the problem, is that there's no accountability, because you can change the narrative. And that's something that's an unprecedented friction point in human evolution, is that we live our lives between two worlds. One is the real world. You and I are sitting here. One is the screen world, what people will see. If you wanted to, I don't think you could re-edit all of this in whatever way you wanted to make it seem this interview go a million ways. And that would be what people's perception of the reality of this conversation would be. We've never lived our lives between two completely different worlds. And that's the thing in Connect Effect. We actually say the experience goes between the real world and the screen world, and then we slowly pull them apart. Because otherwise they're getting conflated and we think they're the same thing. So I would love heads to roll. Just there's never accountability.
No. But the whole COVID experience has definitely ramped up your business idea that you had before COVID.
Yeah.
Like, you identified this as a major problem before COVID, and now the fact that we're coming out of COVID and there is so much kind of mental health issues around isolation and being alone and socializing and stuff like that, it must have just been like jet fuel on your business plan.
It was. And again, I didn't foresee it. I wish I could say I was smart enough to know that we were going to be here. I wasn't.
Well, you weren't in Wuhan, were you?
No, it wasn't. Wuhan is lovely this time of year.
It is. I lived in China. I was in Wuhan all the time. It was one of my favorite cities.
I want to unpack that conversation.
Yeah.
No, I didn't foresee. I knew that when people, the thing that bothered me was when people started saying, you don't believe what I believe, so I unfriend me. I don't want to be your friend. And those were friendships of 20, 30 years. And I was like, okay, that's no good, because there's no way to humanize one another if you don't talk. That whether it's my being a gay male, whether it's being Pakistani, whether it's being a Muslim, whether it's being an immigrant, whether it's being a gay dad, the only way I've ever been able to humanize myself with someone who doesn't believe in what I do is by through conversation. And being a subset of a subset of a subset of a minority, my whole life has been, I'm not who you think I am, because the screen got to you first. That whether it was the Iran hostage crisis, whether it was 9/11, you have perceptions of what I am because the screen got to you first. And so I've always had to unpack what someone who doesn't know another Muslim at all thinks of, because the news got to them first. So that duality of the screen world and the real world has played out in my life constantly, that people had such assumptions about gay people in the 80s and 90s. They had such assumptions about Muslims, such assumptions about Pakistanis. I'm not from like Monaco. I'm from Pakistan. It's like, oh, the haven of terrorism. Like, well, actually, that's not exactly what's true. And so that was what got me very nervous in 2016 on this all unfriending, you believe this way unfriending. And I was like, if you see what someone is seeing on their screen, you would vote for Donald Trump. If you see what someone is seeing, this person seeing on their screen, you would vote for Kamala Harris. Like, if you saw what they saw, you would think the exact same way.
I'm Canadian. I'm not allowed to vote. That's my best get out of jail free card I've got at the moment.
I wish we weren't in an era of complete populism. And I think, I really do wish that there were other options. I wish that there was another party. It's sort of like, it's like as bad as network television was. There were 3 networks at least, ABC, NBC, CBS. Now there's only ever 2 parties. So everything you are, everything you believe is A or B.
Well, you nailed it earlier, right? It's like conflict, yeah. Fear, conflict, and everyone just makes more money at the top.
People don't know what they're for, but they know what they're against.
And rile up the donors.
Yep, rile up the donors.
It's easier when there's just an A or a B and not a C, D, E, F.
If you think the world is ending tomorrow, you're going to donate. And so the world is always ending tomorrow, which is why I feel for young people, because all they've ever known is a world where their screens say the world's about to end, it's about to end, it's about to end. And that burns through empathy. It burns through your ability. It's learned helplessness. Like, if the messaging is every day is dire and deadly, it's incredibly hard to feel hope.
I agree. And I've actually, I was in the news business for over a decade covering China. And I can tell you now that that during COVID, actually, I completely stopped watching television.
Yeah.
And I do listen to like a news podcast every day. It's like 20 minutes, just the like top headlines. War in Ukraine.
Yeah.
Okay, that's still happening, right? You get the basics, but it's so much better listening to the news through audio than to watch it, because you're not sensationalized by anything, and there's no pictures that are making you angrier, because they do all of that really specifically.
Yes.
But just this like little news podcast, and then that's it. I don't read anything. I've totally kind of tuned out of the legacy media.
So I was after Trump won, I remember watching footage. It was literally like from February, very early in his presidency, and I was watching a visit he went to Japan, and it was him and the Japanese prime minister, and the footage was the Japanese prime minister at a koi pond puts in some fish food with his chopsticks, and then Trump puts some fish food with his chopsticks, and then Trump just dumps this fish food in. And it was everywhere, disaster. But being a producer, I was like, they went from a 2-shot to a 1-shot, but it was the same angle. Like, you'd never have a 1-shot of the exact same angle. You'd come from a different angle.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, oh, that's a push-in. And so I found the original footage on Reuters, I think it was. And it was Japanese prime minister, chopsticks, chopsticks. Japanese prime minister dumps the fish food, then Trump. So he was following what the Japanese prime minister did. I happened to have a pitch at CNN the next day. And so I went to CNN, went to the news department, and I was like, what are you doing? And I showed them, and literally showed them the footage that they had re-edited. I'm like, the world is melting because of this presidency. You don't need to create edited stuff to make them like, what is this? They're like, come on, Riaz, everyone does this. And I'm like, oh my God. Like, you're literally re-editing the truth for more viewers. And
to incise them.
And they were already not sleeping. They were already upset. And so I was like, when is it enough? Mm-hmm. And that was the time where you started seeing CNN stores popping up at airports. And I'm like, you guys are doing really well. And they all do it. I'm not saying one side. They all do it. And so all legacy media is, again, every edit has an intention, and the intention is almost always the same. More likes, and help monetize those likes. Yeah. That's it. And so everybody is doing that. Everyone's perception of the world coming from a screen is based on edits for monetizing for likes.
And that's, what do they call that? Someone said that the other day. It's like an echo chamber, right? Like you throw out what you want to see, and it comes right back to you.
And you hear it so many times that you are so certain that it's the only truth. How could someone be so stupid that they've not seen the 100 versions of this truth that I've seen? It's because they're not. They're seeing 100 versions of a different truth that you're not seeing.
Do you think everyone's just sitting in Washington, D.C. being like, wow, we have the keys to the dumbest population on the planet?
I don't think that they're thinking the population is dumb. I think there's an arrogance to think that we know better.
Oh, that's interesting.
I really do. We spent about a year and a half living in D.C. After my daughter was born. My son was just born, and we moved to D.C. because that's where my parents had retired. And we arrived with my son, who was a newborn, and I told my father, hey, the gay son brought you a son. Like, I'm the only one who has children is the gay son. And my father told me he had just been diagnosed with cancer.
Oh, shit.
And he died 21 days later, completely out of nowhere. So I spent a year and a half in D.C. The reason I'd moved to D.C. was no longer there. And so I just met with people. You're from Hollywood, and we'll take a meeting. And I hated everyone. The moral arrogance of these people who live in really nice houses with mid-6-figure incomes, with incredible schools, with incredible insurance, to think that they know better than everyone else because they studied them and have no connection to them. Private jet flying politicians have no connection to the real world. That moral superiority was the thing I hated the most. Mm-hmm. The other thing I hated, and it was very much, they'd all be like, oh, we're known as Hollywood. We're like Hollywood. But they kept saying, we're Hollywood for ugly people. And every time the person would say that to me, and I'd be like, I can't have a reaction to this, because if I agree, that doesn't bode well for the person who's telling me this. But they all kept saying, oh, we're Hollywood for ugly people. And I was like, that's such a weird expression. But it works the same way.
They're creating all the stories.
But we create, like, I got to write something, I got to produce something, I got a product. They traffic in access. Like, they literally, I don't do anything, I don't say anything, but I can get you 10 minutes with the vice president. That's what so there's no product being created. It's all about access, which is such a perverse economy. I think they don't respect the average American. I think that's what the backlash of Trump was. The sense that the institutions, whether it's DC or Hollywood or media, all working together, they're like, fuck you. No, we want someone who is not part of any of you. I think there's a real arrogance. I think there's a complete disconnect to how the world works. I was talking to someone who's a lobbyist, and he said, you'd have congressmen who used to travel back and forth together from like Minnesota to DC, and they would chat. Now they're all flying private, and there's no connection point for them at all. And so they just sit in their echo chambers. But even when they blast each other, when the cameras go off, they know each other.
Mm-hmm.
They hang out together. They're in the same places. This is a facade for us to, to donate more and to get more angry. The fact that America has all the diversity it has and everything's A or B option is an absurd perversion of reality.
It is. It really is.
It really is.
Because it's so ethnically diverse here, and though that ethnic diversity is not channeled into any form of politics.
No. Everything you are, everything you've gone through, everything you believe, everything is A or B. A or B, which boils down to right or wrong. You're either right or wrong. And that's an insane thing. And I really do think if I had to point a finger, I think the DNC and RNC would rather watch the country burn than ever give up any of their share.
Mm-hmm.
Like they literally watch the whole thing burn. They'll take out the legs of candidates they don't believe in. Those two have a stronghold, and they would literally watch the entire country burn before they ever allow a third option.
Well, they would never give up 5% each of their revenue to put 10% into a third party, right? Like that's where we're at. That's the ruthlessness of it.
How much is enough?
Mm-hmm.
Like how much is enough? And I think that's where I see, I think in 2020 when we were locked down, the spend of the presidential election was $14 billion. $14 billion, which you weren't doing events. It was all media buys.
Mm-hmm.
So you have the flailing media propped up by the spends of the politicians who are buying media. Like it's this bizarre circular loop where the thing that's failing is propped up by the money of the thing that they want us to cover. It's a perverse way of doing it.
I love the UK system, actually. I don't know if you knew this, but like they just had an election a couple months ago, right? And it was just like, one day Richie Sunak says, okay, we're going to have an election in 30 days time. And then, everyone organizes themselves, gets onto the news. They start talking about their policies. 30 days later, you have an election, and then we got a new government, and we all just move on. And it's not like this 4 years of campaigning, which is just exhausting.
And you don't govern as much as you campaign.
Yeah.
And I love that. And they limit it. Like, okay, spend whatever you want, but you got 30 days. Not a constant, like every politician I've ever met says, I remember being in a room with a very, 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 very influential senator and asked him, he just spoke to some donors, again, when I was in D.C., and I said, not one thing that you've said is a bone to the other side. Like, you're 100%, everything you do is drilling down on the 50%, but we all know elections are won by the 1%. We know this, like whether it's Chad's in Florida or Wisconsin, that makes the difference. Why don't you throw a bone, a phrase, a subordinate clause to the other side? It's like, my donors wouldn't let me. So it's like, oh, so you know what the right thing to do is, but you would never do it because it doesn't give you the guaranteed donors. And he looked at me very sheepishly and he's like, yes. I was like, okay, well, just know that someone looked you in the eye and called you, bullshit on you.
Yeah.
Which I don't think a lot of people do, look him in the eye and say bullshit. He's worth hundreds of millions now.
Yeah, but these reporters that are on this beat are not asking the right questions.
No.
They're not aware.
Otherwise, you're not invited on the plane.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're not invited on the plane. You're not allowed access. Your press pass is revoked. You play the game or you're not a part of it.
I wonder what Hunter S. Thompson would be writing if he was covering this presidential election.
Okay, yeah, who knows? Who knows? But I just, when we do Connect Effect, our ultimate goal is plug out of, we call it the big show. DC, all of it's a big show. If your house burns down, no one from DC is coming. Not Mitch McConnell, not Nancy Pelosi. Well, none of them could probably physically get there. But no one's coming to help you. Your neighbors are. And so I think the real solution to a lot of this is local. In fact, phase 3 of Connect Effect, first is delivered, second is hosted, third is broadcast. That when we have a location, say in Minneapolis, what we do is every day of the week, we take citizens of Minneapolis and the surrounding area, we connect them through Connect Effect, and then every day of the week, we film a different talk show, different format of local people talking about local issues. Because everything is national. You have neighbors in Wisconsin talking about book bans in Florida, they're not speaking. That this regional micro studios is a way, I think, of getting communities to focus on each other again. They experience the connection in the real world when they come to Connect Effect, and then the shows that we film in that area are for the area, that they're about the issues in the area, because COVID was different in Montana than it was in New York City, but it was one size fits all for everybody. And so the third phase of Connect Effect is broadcast, and to create regional micro studios all over America where people can watch high quality talk shows with people who look like them and sound like them talking about regional issues, getting everyone to unplug from the big show and plug in more locally. That to me is part of the solution.
That's fantastic. No, I think that's the thing that's mostly been eroded during this technological advance we've had, right? It's like we'd rather have friends that are halfway across the world than across the street.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. I mean, very telling that you said that you don't know any of your neighbors.
Yeah.
You know, I think everyone's sort of gun shy and there's no space to go.
Literally gun shy. Literally gun shy in Los Angeles. No, I mean, it's not a joking matter, but I mean, like, you know, I've had people on the podcast that have lost loved ones to gun violence, right? So it's not the reason why I don't know my neighbors, but it's an easy joke to make about gun violence here in LA.
It's very sort of cyclical. It feels very much like late 1970s. Again, I was a young child, but everyone was leaving the cities and moving into the suburbs, and this sense of community in a city was eroding because there was too much violence. I mean, I've never seen homelessness like I've seen now. And so I think everything is, which is why I think when you connect other generations, you're like, oh, you've seen this before. You know, we don't have to feel like the sky is falling every single day. And the screen makes it seem like the sky is falling every single day, and yet it doesn't fall.
Yeah.
And I think that's what people need, is to be connected to other generations, other people that are like, no, I like people. My sense of humanity is reaffirmed. I feel hopeful. And yeah, I voted. It's important to vote in the presidential election, but that fucking narrative's not ruling my day.
Sure.
Because otherwise it'll rule your day and your mind and your mindset every single day.
I think perspective definitely comes from the elder generations. I mean, you know, I have conversations with my dad who's like, oh, you know, this recession, you know, that we went through in 2008, like it wasn't as bad as the one in the late 70s, you know, we lived through that, and he's a banker, right? So he could be like, yeah, this happens every, you know, 10 to 15 years, and you got to be ready for it, and things change, and people have to pivot, and people's lives get, you know, upthrown, but everything kind of moves forward, and people resettle. And you know, just having like someone in their 70s or 80s tell you that they've seen things before,
yes,
and that, you know, it's not going to be the end of the world and all this kind of stuff, whether it's a family member or, you know, someone they meet through your community, like it just having that, like, oh, it's not the end of the world. Like, you know, like things will move on. It's
the exchanging of stories.
Yeah.
And again, I think that's what connection is. It's the exchanging of stories, that I see the world this way. How do you see the world? Again, learn to repeat ratio. If you're learning and you're listening to someone else, that's how you do it. But I was just talking to someone the other day, and they said, yeah, I bought my first house at 22. I got a credit card and put the 5% down payment on a credit card. And I was like, you bought a house on credit?
Mm-hmm.
Like, if it's too good to be true, it probably is.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's one of the things that I think we went off kilter in the West, or at least America's, this need that you have to have credit, you have to have a credit score, and you have to buy things beyond your means.
Mm-hmm.
And that's sort of like a training wheels for everyone to be like, live beyond your means, you know, get into debt, and then you will never accumulate wealth, because you'll always be paying off the debt that you accrued. And that's, now you can't buy a house, you can't buy a car, you can't do anything without credit. And the only way to get credit is to use credit money that you don't have.
Did you ever see that? Did you ever see The Big Short?
Yeah.
And Steve Carell, they remember where they went down to like Florida, and they interviewed some stripper at a strip club, and she's like, oh, I have 5 houses, like paid for them all in cash, like, but no down payment, right? And the people were selling homes in Florida, and Steve Carell got on the phone right away. He's like, Short. He's like, the housing market is about to go absolutely fucking mental. And it's just all this kind of, you have to have this, you have to have that. People stretching themselves unbelievably, borrowing money, for example, to make down payments on houses and stuff like that, just to try to get a toehold, and then having it all come crashing down.
Whenever I travel America, and I'm in, you know, rural Alaska and everyone has so much stuff. That's the commonality between us. We have so much stuff. You know, ugly sweater party. Everyone's buying their ugly sweaters from Amazon, like that you'll only use once a year, but everyone's going to have one.
Mm-hmm.
You know, my kid was doing a 1950s performance, and kids grow so fast. He's 7, and every other kid had a leather jacket they got from Amazon that they would wear once, and we didn't. And I remember someone being like, "Oh, did you not want to?" I was like, "No, because he's going to wear it once. We don't all need to get the leather jacket for the show, for the photo op." But everyone did.
Yeah.
And no matter where I go in America, even people who are not doing well, they have stuff. They have stuff. Everyone has stuff, and that's I think one of the principal signals that a civilization is reaching a new dimension is when it's too much stuff, too much food, too much sugar, too much stuff. And then it slowly starts to decline. I mean, it was the same with Rome, same with everything. Like, when you have so much stuff that it impairs your health, when you physically are dying from the stuff, the sugar, the food, that you just gorge on because it's cheap and inexpensive, that's step one of the beginning of the downfall.
Absolutely. No, it's yeah, wild. Anything else you'd like to chat about your program before we call it today?
No, I aside from the fact that I just talked about the downfall of humanity, I'm actually an incredibly hopeful person, because I get to see people who think they have nothing in common connecting in an incredibly deep and profound way every single day.
That must be really powerful for you, especially.
Incredibly powerful. And then I'm like, oh, the world is good. People are good. They're nervous, but they're incredibly good. And the screen is wrong. It's an illusion of the screen that we don't have things in common. It's an illusion of the screen that there's conflict. It's all going to die. You know, that I was doing Citizens Climate Lobby's national conference. We did Connect Effect. And I talked to the woman who was the president at the time. I'm like, you've got to change your messaging because all of your own constituents have this, like, the world's going to end in 5 years. That takes no account that there could be an advanced technology. We could have a completely new fuel source in 5 years, 10 years that changes the whole game. If there's no hope, there's no reason to live.
But she can't raise money if she's not raising money on fear.
Interesting. She was actually a really, really good person who got it, and she was kicked out by a bigger person who was like, no, fear all the time. So she was pivoting to do the right thing, and she was removed, and someone bigger who came in and is like drilling down on the messaging for lobbying purposes replaced her. So even the person at the top who realized, okay, we can do it a different way, nope.
There should be a documentary at some stage of people who just have been replaced or removed from their various offices or businesses because they tried to actually do the right thing instead of just fear-mongering the Western world into buying and going into greater debt.
Yeah. I think that there is a shift in younger people now, that the narrative of stuff, the narrative of big politics, the narrative of big corporations, they're not buying into it. It doesn't make a happy life. We know that. I don't know about your father, but I will say at the end of my father's life, he was like, yeah, I just came here and I worked for money and I didn't spend time with my family. And now I'm leaving the earth, and that was the wrong thing. I think that there's a version of America that we were sold, which is more and money. And I think that that's led to where we are now, where everything is monetized. And I think younger generations are like, that's not the way to do it. That's not the way to live life. That's not the way to be sustainable. In a human way. I don't mean just environmentally, in a human way. And so as I meet younger people who know that the system is so flawed and corrupt, they're not interested. I mean, I think the participation in the election is like 30%.
For people under 30 years old, I think it's less.
Yeah. It's like the whole thing, the world falling apart, and then you show like a graph which shows the people are actually voting, and it's the end. It's like the vast majority of the country is like, we're just going to do our thing. Like, you guys go on with your crazy, crazy show. We're just going to do our thing and look after our family and look after our community. But this whole I would call it the big show, has nothing to do with us.
Again, local versus national.
Local versus national.
Yeah.
It's only, again, the real world and the screen world. What do we know of the real world? What we see around us. It's real. You are real. You're sitting at this table right now. The screen world is all the big show. I don't know Trump. I don't know Kamala Harris. I don't know any of them. They're all delivered to me on my screen. That's the screen world. It's an illusion.
Editorialized.
Everything in the screen is an edit.
Mm-hmm.
And every edit is an intention.
I do not edit this podcast.
No, I'm so glad to hear that.
Well, look, thank you very much for swinging by the studio this morning. This went, I thought we were just going to talk about TV, but you went off in a totally different direction, which I absolutely loved. And this, your business where you're connecting people locally sounds absolutely timely and much needed. So I wish you the best of luck in that.
Thank you. I think the whole thing of entertainment is stories, but now I think people need to tell their own stories rather than putting them online and editing them. And so creating the forum where they can share their own stories, it's the exact same goal. It's just done in a different way.
That's beautiful. And now we'll go up here to the big screen, and we can show people we're in the same room, for fuck's sake. No Zooms here. Wonderful to meet you today. Thank you.
Nice to meet
Thank you so much for swinging by.
I loved it. In person I'm so glad this was in person.
I'm glad you were in the town. This is great.
Nice to meet you.
Thank you. And we're done.